Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the fourth meeting of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Natural Resources for our 2021-2022 interim. And today it is our pleasure to host a joint meeting with the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Health and Human Services. Ms. King, will you please call the roll?
Senator Dunyate.
Here.
Senator Hansen.
Here.
Senator Hardy.
Here.
Senator Harris.
Here.
Senator Scheibel.
Here.
Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod.
Here.
Assemblyman Ellison.
Present.
Assemblywoman Gorelo.
Here.
Assemblyman Hafen. Assemblywoman Hansen.
Here.
Assemblyman Orentlicker.
Here.
Assemblywoman Titus.
Here.
Chair Peters.
Here.
Chair Watts.
And I am here. Thank you. Please mark Assemblyman Hafen present when he arrives. A few housekeeping items. Members who are joining us virtually, please be sure to keep your video on so that we know that we are maintaining a quorum. Also, be sure to mute your microphone when you're not speaking so that we can minimize background noise. And before beginning, as I've done in our other natural resource meetings during the interim, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are convening this meeting in Las Vegas on the ancestral homelands of the Southern Paiute or Nuwuvi people, and that we also have members joining us across the state from the lands of the Western Shoshone, the Northern Paiute, and Washoe peoples, and that we appreciate the stewardship that they've given our lands and waters for since time immemorial, and commit ourselves to working with them for the betterment and restoration of these places for future generations. Before we get started with the agenda today, I'd like to begin with some time for opening remarks and turn it over to Chair Peters from the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Health and Human Services for anything that she'd like to say.
Thank you, Chair Watts. I would like to welcome members of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Natural Resources and Health and Human Services to this joint meeting. Thank you all for being here. This is a brainchild of Chair Watts and myself, and I'm excited to see us launch it and see how we can kind of cross our committee efforts. I'd also like to take a moment to welcome members of the public who are attending this meeting in person or online. Thank you for being here. Before we start with our presentations today, I'd like to give you a sense of how this joint meeting came about. Climate change affects our world in a variety of ways. Some effects have disproportionate impacts to certain populations based on a variety of factors. We are seeing across the world an increase in extreme weather events such as excessive heat or precipitation, longer periods of drought, stronger winds and storms, and rising sea levels. This in turn leads to an increase in wildfires, water scarcity from sustained drought, and flooding from destructive storms, just to name a few of the correlated impacts. Unfortunately, Nevada is significantly impacted by several of these extreme weather events, such as extreme heat, drought, and air pollution. I want to share with you some key messages from the recent 2022 Nevada's Climate Summary of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Centers for Environmental Information. Since the beginning of the 20th century, temperatures in Nevada have increased by almost 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit. This historically unprecedented warming will continue throughout the century and will worsen the extreme weather we are already experiencing. The increase in temperatures is impacting snowpack, which is already impacting our water supplies for both northern and southern Nevada. Our groundwater supply is also shrinking and water quality is deteriorating. Nevada is currently the most arid state in the country, but annual precipitation projections remain uncertain, likely impacted significantly by these extreme events. We have lived in drought conditions for the better part of the last 2 decades. Wildfire has grown and will continue to be more intense and occur more often in and around Nevada. Higher temperatures will dry our soils and intensify future drought and erosion from flood events. A perfect example occurred last week, where we experienced warning advisories for excessive heat in the Las Vegas Valley and surrounding states. We hear every year now of record-breaking temperatures and have the most severe effects on the most vulnerable members of our communities. The extreme storm events seen in Yellowstone National Park this week is another example of current impacts to weather patterns resulting in significant impacts to both humans and the environment in our region. Climate change is an issue that intersects both the world of natural resources and the health of our society. This is why Chair Watts and I decided to have this joint meeting to discuss the effects that climate change has on the health of Nevadans. Nevada's communities already experience many negative consequences of climate change. We have farmers with less water supply for their crops, seniors who live in danger due to excessive heat, and children who cannot play outside because of wildfire smoke that makes the air unhealthy to breathe. The impacts of climate change are not limited to our physical environment. We are seeing secondary impacts to mental and behavioral health as a result of the changes in climate and weather patterns, including isolation due to wildfire smoke health warnings and extreme heat events. We live in this dichotomy where we are encouraging more outdoor activity while experiencing adverse effects to our open and outdoor spaces due to climate events. During our meeting today, we will have several presentations on the interrelation between climate change and the health of our communities in Nevada. In the health and human services world, we refer to this as the health of the public, or public health. First, we will have several presenters who will show us how excessive heat poses certain dangers to our community. We will learn how to respond to heat events and to mitigate the dangers of extreme heat in the long run. Second, our presenters will discuss increased air pollution and its different forms, associated health risks, and how wildfire smoke exacerbates certain respiratory diseases such as asthma and COVID-19. Third, we will discuss how climate change will increase water issues in our state, and we can ask questions on what to do about it. Fourth, we will explore in depth how climate change disproportionately affects certain communities in our state and what can be done to increase environmental justice. And finally, we will hear about the impacts of climate change on mental health and well-being, which I especially look forward to. I'm looking forward to the presentations today and would like to extend my gratitude to the presenters willing to present today. Chair Watts, this concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to add a couple of additional statements, although I think that was a great overview of how this meeting came to be and some of the issues that we're going to be covering today. As a reminder, just to both members of the committees, our focus is not on how we address climate change from the perspective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but really looking at the impacts that we're already seeing today and that we are likely to see as the trends over the recent decades of hotter temperatures and some of these impacts that we've seen to the climate if they continue or worsen, and making sure that we are prepared to adapt to them, to mitigate them, and to build a more resilient community. In the Natural Resources Committee up to this point, we've looked at impacts on our infrastructure. We've looked at impacts that could affect our financial health and our fiscal health as a state and in our local governments. And now I think it's important, that we look at the most direct human level of the impacts that Nevadans could face as a result of increased temperatures, increased air pollution, and to figure out some innovative solutions to help protect the health and safety of families across Nevada. And so I think Chair Peters mentioned, what we can do about it, and that's what we want to do, is be solutions oriented. And again, I think there are other committees that are going to look at how we address the causes of climate change itself. Here in our committees, we're going to look at what we can do to help protect public health from the impacts that we're already seeing. So thank you all for being here today. I'd like to make a few other housekeeping announcements. During the interim, we typically have 2 opportunities for public comment, once at the beginning and once at the end of the meeting. Members of the public may provide testimony in different ways, all of which are listed on the agenda. In order to call in for public testimony, which will be the next item on our agenda, dial 669-900-6833. When prompted, provide the meeting ID 814-6977-2189 and then press the pound key. Our broadcast and production services staff will indicate to you when it's your turn to speak. We ask that public comment be kept to 3 minutes so that everyone can speak and we can get through our agenda in a timely fashion. If you would like to provide written comments, you can submit them electronically before, during, or after the meeting by email to nrinterim@lcb.state.nv.us or mail them to the LCB Research Division at 401 South Carson Street, Carson City, Nevada 89701. And I would just like to note for members, I believe, for those of us in person, we already did have 1 written public comment submitted. And so I would like to thank Ms. Bidwell for submitting that. With that, we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which is public comment. Please remember to clearly state and spell your name and limit your comments to 3 minutes. So we will start in Las Vegas, if anyone wishes to provide public comment, as well as in Carson City. If anyone wishes to make public comment, you can go ahead and take a seat and we'll go to you after we start in person in Las Vegas. Welcome, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Marco Vallada, City of Las Vegas. For the record, I'm here today. I did submit some written comments on behalf of a group of local governments across the states in concurrence. Lisa Corrado, who's the Director of Community Development Services with City of Henderson, Marcy Henson, the Director of the Department of Environmental and Sustainability at Clark County, Suzanne Groneman with the Sustainability Program Manager, City of Reno, and Andrew Kellman, the Metropolitan Planning Organization Director at RTC Southern Nevada. And I'm with the city's Planning Department and Long Range Planning Division and the Office of Sustainability. You do have the written comments, but I'll highlight a few of the things that I think are relevant today. We do thank the committee for addressing this topic. Of course, Las Vegas and Reno, both metro areas, are working to address these major environmental challenges, and the presentations today will lay all those out. But we are definitely being impacted by the drier and hotter weather, especially in neighborhoods that are in low income and disadvantaged communities. These heat waves that we're experiencing are longer in duration, they're more intense, they're more frequent, and they're further exacerbated by the urban heat island effect. Young children and the elderly are among the most vulnerable populations, but research has been showing that anyone in any population group could be subject to the 3 components of heat vulnerability, whether it's exposure, sensitivity, or adaptive capacity, and regardless of age and risk. So to address and mitigate this particular climate hazard, the municipalities that I've mentioned have addressed urban heat through master planning efforts or climate action planning efforts, and specifically with land use, transportation, urban forestry, public health, and environmental justice. As those plans were under development, the Southern Nevada entities coordinated with RTC and regional stakeholders on an extreme heat vulnerability analysis. And that study did confirm that and validated that specific areas in the Las Vegas Valley with populations that are most vulnerable to extreme heat, East Las Vegas, downtown Las Vegas, areas around the Strip, and older and more mature neighborhoods in Henderson, are experiencing some of these threats. Anything that's inside the McCarran Boulevard ring in Reno is the same way. These areas do have typically more diverse and economically challenged parts of the city, and do have aging infrastructure and tree canopy. The RTC's technical advisory group has representatives from the Health Department, UNLV, SNWA, and other nonprofits, and staff members from respective scientific fields. And we're working all together to mitigate extreme heat. So some of the activities that we've been engaged with over the past couple of months and in the past year have included educational events that have called attention to the benefits of trees and the urban heat island effect. City of Reno has addressed extreme heat in their Reimagine Reno Master Plan and the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, as well as have an urban forestry board that has undertaken efforts in tree protection and preservation, as well as building performance standards. Recently in Clark County, we've launched a new website, Stay Cool Clark County, that provides extreme heat information and resources to the public. And City of Las Vegas, we've worked with RTC on specific plan implementation activities, including tree-lined complete streets that provide more shade for pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users on major corridors in those vulnerable areas.
Mr. Vallota, if you could please wrap
Yes.
up your remarks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So we do ask the committee to consider these public, private, and nonprofit sector efforts that are currently underway jointly, including possible funding or legislation that might be recommended at the next legislative session. And we do look forward to working alongside this committee and the partners presenting today to ensure communities throughout our state are livable, equitable, and resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Mr. Vallota. We appreciate it. We look forward to your ideas and continuing to build partnership to address these issues. I think both Chair Peters and myself have some significant heat islands within the districts that we represent. Anyone else wishing to make public comment in Las Vegas, please go ahead and come forward. Sorry, Mr. Silva, your mic is not on. So if you could just turn it on, you don't have to spell it again, but just state your name for the record and then please begin.
On now? Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Plan believes that everyone has the right to live in a clean and healthy environment regardless of their race, income, gender, or immigration status. Currently, poor and marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by pollution and climate change, while dirty fossil fuel and mining corporations rake in millions in profits in the state of Nevada. Low-income Black, Indigenous, and Nevadans of color are especially suffering living in areas with hotter temperatures, dirtier air, and fewer green spaces. North Las Vegas and Las Vegas were both among the top 10 cities in the country where the lowest income households live in the hottest neighborhoods. And those who work outside are risking their health to make a living with increasing heat waves. Just last weekend, Las Vegas reached record high temperatures of nearly 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And, we're expected to reach 109 today. Las Vegas Vegas's increasing and potentially fatal temperatures only increase my worries for my family's health, and in particular, my grandfather's health. He often likes to go for a walk and see his neighborhood, but recently, with his declining health, he has gotten tired and fallen while outside, sometimes having to wait hours for someone to arrive at home and pick him up. Were this to happen to my grandfather today, when it'll reach 109 outside, my grandfather would be in serious danger. But excessive heat is only one of the problematic impacts of climate change facing Nevadans today. Air pollution from our busy freeways, often running through low-income neighborhoods, have also led to disproportionate health outcomes and high risks of asthma in these communities. And while transitioning away from fossil fuel engines to electric vehicles is one piece of the puzzle, the demand for battery minerals such as lithium and copper in the state can cause devastating and irreversible damage to frontline communities in rural and tribal areas of Nevada by contaminating their water. Our focus should be to expand and electrify low or zero fare public transit, including biking and walking infrastructure, in order to reduce transit-related pollution and overall passenger car travel, while improving transit access for mobility-limited households. And also by saying that we should also not be promoting driverless vehicles or robo-taxis, as they'll just put more cars on the road, and that's not what we need. We are in this place today because for decades, communities of color have been neglected in the creation of sound environmental and energy and land use policy. At Plan, we believe that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solutions. We must ensure that any potential policies to address our climate crisis use an environmental justice lens and work to mitigate the disproportionate impacts faced by communities. Thank you.
Thank you. As Jose Silva, just to make sure the record's clear, thank you for your comments, and we look forward to working with you to ensure that the community is involved. Anyone else wishing to make public comment in Las Vegas, please come forward.
How you guys doing? Good morning. My name is Anthony Brim, for the record. So I know as we look at what communities are affected generally in our area, in our society, I know the main focus is usually nitrous oxide coming from vehicles, as well as the creation of ozone. One area I feel like isn't getting as much attention that should is recreational planes. They spew lead gases, especially in low-income areas. That's where most of private planes are able to land at. And we're seeing that more and more violence is in schools, but the answer is looking at more policing instead of actually looking at environmental factors. As well as, I know that Nevada is trying to expand, especially Southern Nevada. So I feel like as we expand, we should be looking at creating more parks in general areas or in general neighborhoods. So that way we have more greener areas, not as much of a heat island effect or not compounding as much. I know we're also looking at different ways of collecting greenhouse gases. So I know that they're opening up a trash type of methane collection outside of the city soon, or they're trying to work with a company to try to bring that along, which is great. But I feel like there's also other avenues as well. There's a research institution in Australia that works with local governments, and they actually create aluminum graphene batteries and using carbon dioxide from the air to create the graphene. And aluminum is one of the most recycled and one of the most recyclable metals in the United States. So I feel as though we could bring that to Southern Nevada. Other areas of industry that we could bring as well that creates jobs as well as helps create solutions for the climate problem is places or things like solar panel recycling plants, because as we know, solar panels are becoming to be more installed into Southern Nevada, but as time goes by, those panels will need to be recycled in some type of way, hopefully responsibly. So I think if we're a world leader in that, especially trying to bring in as many solar panels as we are, it would set a precedent for everybody else. Another thing to look at is possibly tire recycling plants. In Europe, they have a lot of those that are very close to being as emission neutral as possible. So I feel as though us looking into partnering with maybe some of them would be a good look as well. And then finally, I want to end it with hydroponic farming indoors specifically, just because the amount of nutrients per weight can be 10 to 100 times more when grown indoors, just because you don't have as many pesticides, as well as fertilizers at toxic levels that kind of kill the bacteria / fungal connections that roots have that allow them to absorb some of these nutrients, because a lot of them aren't water soluble until they interact with these bacteria. So again, just creating more sustainable and environmentally focused solutions, I feel like is something we can all do together. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Brim. And just as a reminder, if anyone does have written remarks, please do turn them into our staff. We can, even if you don't want them posted, it helps us in composing the minutes. Anyone else wishing to provide public comment here in Las Vegas? Seeing none, we'll go to public comment in Carson City.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the joint committees. My name is Jeanette Belts, Jeanette, last name Belts, Belz, representing the Nevada Psychiatric Association. Just some very brief comments in advance of item number 12, which will be presented by Dr. Elizabeth Haas from the Mallory Behavioral Health Crisis Center. Just today, there was a timely report released in Oregon from their state health authority on the impact of climate factors on mental health of children and youth, with special emphasis on wildfires. I am going to put these remarks in written form and include the link there so that will be available to you as well as to the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bells. We appreciate it. The next member wishing to provide public comment, please go ahead, turn on the mic, state your name, and you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Watts and Chairwoman Peters. My name is Audie Lee Allen, Ottiliallen. I'm from Reno, Nevada, and I just finished 6th grade at Collin Ranch Elementary School. I want to thank Battleborn Progress and Grassroots Girls for encouraging me to attend this meeting. 2 years ago, during the pandemic, a wildfire broke out on a hill near my school. Me and my family were evacuated, and it ended less than a block away from my house. It was really scary. This inspired me this year to organize the Collin Ranch Climate Collective, a club at my school I started. A total of 18 kids who have all felt the hard impacts of climate change and did something. These wildfires and smoke days caused by huge neighboring fires are every year becoming more frequent and more dangerous. It affects everyone whether they realize it or not. Wildfires and smoke are becoming more common due to climate change, which the effects which cannot be ignored. We need to face the facts of greenhouse gases and how it is harming the earth and us along with it. So I am here to urge you to take immediate action so that we can slow the effects of fires, warming temperatures, and droughts. There are a thousand ways to do this. Planting trees, paving only as much road as we need to, not any more than that. My friends and I are taking action, and we think you should too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Allen, for your remarks and for your engagement. Thanks for being part of the legislature and our governmental process. We'll move on to the next speaker wishing to provide public comment in Carson City.
Good morning, Chairman Watts and Peters and other members of the Interim Committee. For the record, my name is Betty Bishop, Betty, B-E-T-T-Y, Bishop, B-I-S-H-O-P, and I'm the president of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul Little Flower Conference in Reno. Our nonprofit organization provides support, services, and financial aid to people who are in need. Today, you are being presented with scientific reports and data on how global warming is negatively impacting our planet, our country, and specifically Nevada with heat waves, drought, flooding, wildfires, and other catastrophes. But I have chosen to provide information based on stories from marginalized citizens, specifically those living in tent encampments, who are currently experiencing the effect of warming. The camps are typically located near harmful, polluted areas like freeways, railroad tracks, and industrial warehouses. None of our unsheltered from the El Rancho camp could be here today in person, but when our volunteers asked what they needed to do to prepare for triple-digit temperatures or smoke, they emphatically stated, first of all, access to clean drinking water, containers for water, sanitary wipes, UV sunglasses, hats, sunscreen, spray bottles, washcloths that can be used for cooling, and bags for garbage. Many of our unhoused unhoused or elderly, have disabilities, and the act of physically getting up and down, in and out of their tents is extremely difficult. We have encountered people who are suffering with stage 4 cancer and others who wear colostomy bags and use catheters. When the sun is shining, most of their tents are already stifling hot, as there are few shaded areas available. They desperately need housing, but in the meantime, they need access to restrooms and water stations where they can wash their hands. Some have mentioned the importance of having community cooling stations during the summer and warming centers during the winter. Drafting fair and equitable legislation addressing climate change is very challenging, but the Environmental Justice Coalition and other agencies comprised of physicians, scientists, engineers, and faith-based organizations have developed good recommendations. There's an urgent need for our political institutions to take responsibility, plan, coordinate, provide the needed oversight and enforcement to ensure environmental legislation is equitable and designed for the common good. We must protect our people and care for our natural resources for our generation and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Ms. Bishop, and for speaking up for the homeless members of our community who weren't able to attend the meeting today. We'll go on to the next person wishing to provide public comment in Carson City.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair and members of the committees, for the opportunity to give testimony today. My name is Tracy Martinez, C-H-A-S-I-T-Y, Martinez, M-A-R-T-I-N-E-Z, and I'm with Faith in Action Nevada and also a resident of Reno. Today, I join alongside with other organizations and community members across the state to talk about how climate change is impacting the health of our communities. I want to start off by stating that I am part of a generation that has never known a stable climate. It's been 3 decades that we've been talking about climate change, and we still have so much to do to address this existential threat. And I'm also a person of faith, but I am very fearful for my generation and also for future generations. The topic of climate anxiety is a growing reality for many of us. And there are many folks, even peers and myself, that I talk with, that we don't even want to have kids because we don't know what type of future they would inherit. But we know that this crisis does not affect everyone equally. Those who have contributed least to the problem, both locally and globally, are also those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and have the fewest resources to adapt. Climate change is happening here and now in our state, and it disproportionately impacts people that are low income and communities of color. In Reno, the areas with the highest concentration of air pollution along freeways and around industry are also located near low income communities of color. Those same communities also lack access to green spaces and consequently opportunities that would promote physical health as well as mental health. Aside from the day-to-day pollution that's also increasing due to more people moving into the region and more increase of cars on the road, we also have the increasing threat of summer wildfire smoke. I remember last summer I was driving home from work, and I looked to my left and I saw the smoke plume from the Caldor fire at South Lake Tahoe, and I looked to my right and I saw the smoke plume from the Beckworth Complex fire in Northern California. And our whole region was just surrounded by dense smoke. And I was thinking how privileged I was to have shelter, to have a vehicle, to work indoors, but for a lot of our neighbors, that's not the case. For those who have no choice but to live or work outside without proper protection, I can only imagine the effect on their lungs and overall health. It breaks my heart to see this becoming our new normal, and it really can't be our new normal. I'm asking that you all, committee members, would put equity at the forefront of climate and clean energy policy conversations, and that you would put forth legislation that directly benefits low-income communities of color here in Nevada, as well as for future generations. Let's make a just transition that leads us to a cleaner, healthier future, and that doesn't leave any communities behind, but create a pollution-free and just Nevada for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Ms. Martinez. Anyone else wishing to provide public comment in Carson City, please come forward. All right, seeing none. Broadcast Production Services, can we see if anyone wishes to provide public comment via phone?
Thank you, Chair. To participate in public comment, please press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. Again, if you wish to participate, please press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits of 986, please go ahead. You can press *6 to unmute yourself.
Hello, this is John Hatter. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Hatter. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is John Hatter, Director of Great Basin Resource Watch. I really appreciate the formation of this meeting and the committee. Obviously, there's an urgent need. And thank you so much, committee members and chairs, to initiating this process. I just have a short comment. I think there's a lot of, obviously, a lot of urgency and importance. I think we need to be careful how we move forward in addressing climate change, that we don't have unintended consequences. Some of a lot of new technologies that are requiring mineral extraction, and those will have potentially unintended consequences for communities living rurally, could change their lifestyle permanently. And also, mineral extraction is also a driver of climate change. So I think the key is for us to think about reducing demand, energy demand for materials, reducing vehicular traffic in general, transformation of try to transform our urban areas, in particular, that are more transportation efficient, that are more walkable, that involve less use of energy and water in general. So I think that's a general comment. I'd also like to point out that the development of renewable solar technology is better for cities as it's deployed as distributed generation within the urban areas. As distributed generation, the solar panels and similar technologies will actually capture some of the heat and the light energy and transform it into electricity instead of it just heating up the city. And so it's actually a good way to capture some of that heat and energy and use it directly, as opposed to building large construction facilities out in the desert somewhere, and the cities don't benefit from that additional factor. Plus, it also provides good paying long-term employment for the area. So just a couple of thoughts as you move forward. And again, thank you so much, chairs and committee, for working on this important issue. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Hatter. BPS, let's move on to the next caller.
Caller, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Watts, Chair Peters, and members of the committee. My name is Christy Cabrera, CHRISTI CABRERA, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for the Nevada Conservation League. I'd like to start by thanking you for arranging today's meeting. Climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels for energy generation and transportation is the greatest threat to both Nevada's natural resources and the health of our communities. Reno and Las Vegas are the two fastest warming cities in the United States, according to Climate Central. Since 1970, Reno now experiences 65 more days of above average temperatures, and Las Vegas experiences 41 more days. This is bad news for our public health because extreme heat has been linked to a wide range of physical and mental illnesses and causes more deaths than any other weather-related hazard in the United States, more than hurricanes, tornadoes, or flooding. The Southwest's warming climate and prolonged drought are drying out soils and vegetation, sparking more frequent and intense wildfires. The result is destroyed habitat and deteriorating air quality that makes us sick. The American Lung Association, who we'll hear from shortly, says that climate change conditions like heat and stagnant air increase the risk of unhealthy ozone levels. Las Vegas and Reno are both on ALA's list of 25 most polluted cities for ozone or smog. High ozone levels pose greater risks to our most vulnerable populations: children, seniors, people with existing lung or heart conditions, low-income individuals, and people of color. Tailpipe emissions contain both greenhouse gases and unhealthy pollutants. And the air pollution is inside as well. Burning methane gas indoors without proper ventilation is also linked to worse asthma, especially for kids. The evidence is clear. Nevada must act now to reduce climate pollution for the future of our state. The best path forward for Nevada is clean electrification. Homes, buildings, and vehicles that are energy efficient and powered by Nevada's homegrown renewable energy. We need strong policies supported by federal infrastructure and public health funds to build a cleaner and healthier future for all Nevadans. The Nevada Conservation League looks forward to working with you all to advance these important issues. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for your comments, Ms. Cabrera. BPS, can we move on to the next caller?
Okay, can everyone hear me? Oh.
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
My name is Kelby Peeler, spelled K-E-L-B-Y, last name P-E-E-L-E-R. I'm a resident in Reno, Nevada. I've lived in Reno off and on throughout my life, moving between California and Nevada. So I'm used to shifting between microclimates. But my most recent move to Reno, right before the pandemic hit, I got to experience those few smoke-filled summers that we've had. So I was fortunate enough to have a shelter, though, and a place to escape the heat and what seemed like the worst of the smoke. But even then, obviously, it's still harmful. My own air conditioning also at the time happened to break down during those summers. And so that minor experience of mine just made me think about all our most vulnerable community members, like the houseless and those who have to resort to like weekly motels, many of which don't even have functioning air conditionings. So just these kind of things started running through my mind. And I looked up some facts, and I didn't even realize this, but according to the Southern Nevada Extreme Heat Vulnerability Analysis, there were 84 days in 2019 alone that had temperature higher than 100 degrees. And so just in 2 years, in 2021, there was a 75% increase in heat exposure cases compared to just the summer before in 2020. So I just wanted to highlight, the consequences that this has on a range of populations, especially like the elderly, which has already been mentioned in previous comments, and also highlight the implication that more and more of our aging population will be faced with the likelihood of heat-related deaths. So I think that's something that needs to be highlighted. Another thing that I want to mention is when it comes to low-income households, they use significantly less energy from fossil fuels, while at the same time in Las Vegas, they live in some of the hottest neighborhoods in the nation. So Nevada's most vulnerable communities and the neighborhoods, they don't possess the infrastructure or the resources to escape even or even to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. So I think providing resources to those neighborhoods and communities needs to be really a priority. So I just wanted to thank the committee for having this interim meeting at all. And I encourage the committee to keep doing more to account for the ways climate change affects a diverse range of populations. And one final thing, I also hope that there's a concerted effort is made to actually reach out to those most affected and to include them in more and more and more conversations. Like, this is a great start, but I just include them in more and more conversations and efforts for finding solutions to help, inform future legislation. But again, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. BPS, let's move on to the next caller.
Hello, chairs and members of the committee. My name is Chantelle Roberts. That's Chauntille, Roberts, Roberts. And I am a concerned resident of North Las Vegas. I have a concern with the roadways of Cheyenne. It's a street I happen to use often. Cheyenne has a high frequency of industrial and commercial vehicles going down the busy highway and freeways due to factories, bus stations, and warehouse all being located in my area. I have a 71-year-old grandfather who lives with me, and he likes to take walks to the store, but he also has dementia, and that means he ends up wandering out the house, and this is happening to happen more often. Due to climate change, it's been extremely hot, especially in the areas where I live, since we have factories that expel gas, very busy roadways, and this area must contain a higher rate of air contamination coming from car exhaust, and this is very concerning for someone like myself. There have been numerous incidents where my grandfather has either walked to the store or wandered out of the home and has fallen due to heat exhaustion. He has suffered from a heat stroke, and he has been hospitalized for this as well. I would encourage the meeting body today to see some sort of canopy or built infrastructure in order to provide shade for pedestrians, because as you walk through Cheyenne, where I live, there are no trees or even shaded bus stops. Some parts of the street are missing sidewalk. So if my grandfather were to pass out again on the wrong side of the street, he could possibly fall into the road and cause a car accident. I live a quarter mile away from the freeway, and it's a major street and is almost always busy at any time of the day. I would implore you to get serious and create more efficient streets where pedestrians, bus riders, and drivers all have the same ability to be safe. Climate change will be making life worse for many of us, but the task is for our local government to improve its residents' quality of life, like my grandfather's, and to create a more sustainable future for people who look like us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. BPS, let's move on to the next caller.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Brenda Rodriguez. That's BRENDA-RODRIGUEZ, and I am the Story Bank organizer for Battle Born Progress. Last year, alongside our partners at the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, Faith Organizing Alliance, Faith in Action, Make the Road Nevada, Chispa Nevada, Make It Work Nevada, and Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund, we released a report focused on decarbonization and equity-focused climate strategies for Nevada. We know that Nevadans are already living through climate change. Heat waves, drought, air pollution are already affecting our health, our environment, and our ability to make a living wage. Low-income Black, Indigenous, and Nevadans of color are especially suffering, living in areas with hotter temperatures, dirtier air, fewer green spaces, and higher energy bills. This means that low-income Nevadans are having to choose between higher energy bills in the summer and paying for other household expenses. And Black and Brown Nevadans who work outside are risking their health to make sure they are making a living with increasing heat waves. Yet they are also too often left out of clean energy efficiency, and transportation solutions that can lower our bills and improve our health. Climate change efforts will only be successful if our state can protect vulnerable Nevadans and build resilient communities. Nevadans leaders must champion equitable climate solutions as we transition to a pollution-free future. If policies are not designed well, these Nevadans will receive little benefit. Low-income households of color use 30% less energy from fossil fuels than highest-income households, contributing the least to the planet's warming, yet are by far the most impacted. If decarbonization policies aren't designed to help low-income communities of color most harmed by climate change, then those policies could do more harm than good. Through policies that will not only fight climate change, but also reduce pollution in our neighborhoods, we can build a new kind of Nevada that runs on clean, affordable, local energy and puts people's health over corporate profits. This means a thriving, pollution-free future, not just for our children, but for us now too. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your comments. BPS, let's move on to the next caller, please.
Good morning, chairs and members of the committee. My name is Jose Rivera, Joserivera for the record. Based in Las Vegas, I'm an environmental justice organizer with Make the Road Nevada. I am here to speak on behalf of my community, specifically low-income immigrant households and street vendors, who are oftentimes left out of the conversation. I witnessed the health impacts affecting my community members exposed to extreme weather temperatures and poor air quality filled with toxic pollutants daily. These community members are outside under these extreme weather conditions with no access to health care when they fall ill from it. The extreme heat we face often causes headaches, heat blisters, and malaise, but they continue to push through in order to make ends meet. For example, I met a street vendor. Her name is Mary Madrigal, and she's a carwashera, works 6 days a week from early hours of the morning to late afternoon washing cars in East Las Vegas. She is exposed to dangerous heat effects for long hours, breathing in the poor air quality in the area, while trying to provide some form of income for her family. The lack of resources offered affects Mary, as she is a community member who also has no access to AC at home and is constantly exposed to dangerous heat temperatures. The impacts that she is having on her health with no access to health insurance are where my concerns lie. We are all well aware of the heat island's effects taking place where the most vulnerable communities are located, and it is time to focus our efforts on finding solutions for these families. The state needs to begin implementing policies that include every resident in the area, including essential working families, regardless of their legal status. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera, for your remarks. BPS, can we move on to the next caller, please?
Hi, my name is Natalie Powell from Las Vegas, Natalia Powell. I'm a mother of 6, and about 5 years ago, we moved to the east side of Las Vegas, and we moved from Blue Diamond. That was a very drastic move for us. The air quality was completely different. 3 of my 6 kids have asthma, as do I, and since the move, we've been hospitalized and had to do several asthma treatments because where we live is we live right next to a substation, a power substation, and right next to the busy street of Nellis and Sahara. And I really just want to encourage the leaders and the members of the board to really push for electrical vehicles, more cleaner air, because right now the air quality in Clark County is at an F. And it's really imperative that we clean this up for our children, for our future. Otherwise, we won't have anything else to leave to them. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Ms. Powell. BPS, can we move on to the next caller?
Hi, Rodrigo will be using an interpreter and delivering his remarks in Spanish. Go ahead, Rodrigo.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Rodrigo González y soy un organizador comunitario con Chispa Nevada, un programa de la Liga de Votantes por la Conservación.
Good morning. My name is Rodrigo Gonzalez, and I am a community organizer with Chispa Nevada, a program of the League of Conservation Voters.
Chispa Nevada se empeña en desarrollar el poder de la comunidad latina en Las Vegas para tener más control sobre las decisiones que afectan a nuestro medio ambiente.
Chispa Nevada is committed to building the power of the Latino community in Las Vegas to have more control over decisions that affect our environment.
Hoy estoy aquí para representar a los cientos de nuestros miembros que son agudamente afectados por el cambio climático en Nevada, que toma forma en la contaminación del aire, el calor extremo, la sequía y los incendios.
I'm here today to represent the hundreds of our members who are acutely affected by climate change in Nevada, which takes the form of air pollution, extreme heat, drought, and wildfires.
Como organizador comunitario, yo hablo cada día con docenas de latinos en Nevada y hablamos sobre cómo el medio ambiente está cambiando y cómo lo está sintiendo nuestra comunidad.
As a community organizer, I speak to dozens of Latinos in Nevada every day, and we talk about how the environment is changing and how our community is feeling it.
Los latinos estamos más predispuestos a padecer de asma y otros problemas respiratorios debido a que nuestra comunidad ha sido forzada a vivir en barrios muy cercanos a sitios de contaminación como las carreteras. Esta contaminación ha empeorado por la crisis climática. Las comunidades de color de bajos ingresos en Nevada tienen más probabilidades de vivir en islas urbanas de calor, áreas con temperaturas más calientes y menos espacios verdes. No tener acceso a la energía limpia y a las opciones de transporte limpio, como el transporte público y los automóviles electrificados. La energía solar en la azotea o medidas de eficiencia energética.
Latinos are more predisposed to suffer from asthma and other respiratory problems because our community has been forced to live in neighborhoods very close to sources of contamination, such as highways. This pollution has been made worse by the climate crisis. Low-income communities of color in Nevada are more likely to live on urban heat islands, areas with warmer temperatures and fewer green spaces. Not having access to clean energy and clean transportation options like electrified public transportation and electrified vehicles, solar power on the roof, or energy efficiency measures.
Tengo voluntarios que tienen problemas para respirar en días de alta congestión de smog. Berta Robledo, una señora de más de 80 años y una de nuestras voluntarias más activas y entusiastas, ya le cuesta más trabajo colaborar con Chispa Nevada por el calor tan intenso que se siente en Las Vegas. También tenemos miembros que tienen niños que no pueden salir afuera a jugar o participar en deportes por la contaminación y por el gran calor. Y tengo voluntarios que temen por el futuro de sus niños aquí en Las Vegas, como la señora Ángeles Sánchez, porque no habrá agua para sostener a nuestras familias en unas pocas décadas.
I have volunteers who have trouble breathing on days of high smog congestion. Berta Robledo, a woman over 80 years old and one of our most active and enthusiastic volunteers, is already having a harder time collaborating with Chispa Nevada due to the intense heat felt in Las Vegas. We also have members who have children who cannot go outside to play or participate in sports because of the pollution and the extreme heat. And I have volunteers who fear for the future of their children here in Las Vegas, like Mrs. Ángeles Sánchez, because there will be no water to support our families in a few decades.
Es por esto y muchas más razones que nuestra comunidad está pidiendo a nuestros oficiales electos que tomen la acción. No podemos continuar así.
It is for this and many more reasons that our community is asking our elected officials to take action. We can't continue like this.
Aunque nuestra comunidad no ha causado esta contaminación, estamos sufriendo el primer impacto del cambio climático y estamos pagando con nuestras vidas.
Although our community has not caused this pollution, we are experiencing the first impact of climate change, and we are paying with our lives.
Por eso pedimos acción de su parte. Pedimos una rápida transición a autobuses escolares eléctricos, a un transporte público limpio, a más árboles en nuestros barrios y más conservación de nuestra agua.
That is why we ask for action on your part. We call for a quick transition to electric school buses, clean public transportation, more trees in our neighborhoods, and more conservation of our water.
Más que eso, demandamos justicia climática, a parar la contaminación y los que contaminan.
More than that, we demand climate justice. Stop pollution and those who pollute.
Nuestras familias merecen respirar aire limpio. Nuestros niños merecen tener un futuro saludable y un planeta sostenible. Eso es todo. Muchísimas gracias.
Our families deserve to breathe clean air. Our children deserve to have a healthy future and a sustainable planet. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, Señor Gonzalez Yanez, por su testimonio. And thank you for your comments. BPS, let's move to the next caller, please.
Chair, the public line is open and working, but there are no additional callers at this time.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who testified. Again, if you have any remarks in writing, please do submit those to our committee staff, both so that we can get them distributed to the members, but also to help in compiling the minutes. Also, I'd just like to thank the many people who spoke, who did a better job than probably any member of this committee could in discussing the importance of equity and providing firsthand examples of the impacts that are being felt in communities across the state from these issues. So with that, we'll now move into the presentation portion of our agenda. First up, we have an overview of extreme heat events, vulnerabilities to heat exposure in the community, and strategies to strengthen heat resiliency. We are going to get a presentation from the Gwynn Center. Welcome, Dr. Brune. Once you are ready, go ahead and introduce yourself for the record, and you may begin.
Good morning, Chairman Watts and Chairwoman Peters and members of the interim committees. Nancy Brune for the record. So I'm going to present an overview of the report that we did a year ago. The title is Strengthening Heat Resiliency in Communities of Color in Southern Nevada. And I just want to provide a couple of comments for context. This was funded by the Walmart Foundation, and they gave us the scope. And so really the findings and the policy implications apply to the entire state of Nevada. As we've just heard from public comment, Reno is also an urban heat island. And even though this is focused on communities of color, specifically Native Americans and Latinos, it applies to any vulnerable population. It could be seniors on fixed incomes, as well as other members of our community. So the project really involved a landscape analysis and then a needs assessment where we went out and talked to members of the community and then followed that with a policy gap analysis and then provided some policy solutions for your consideration. Really briefly, with respect to the landscape analysis, we looked at, over the last couple of years, again, focused on Southern Nevada, to what extent do current policy, statutes, laws truly address extreme heat and the impacts of extreme heat? We found that the top heat issue identified in 44 policies, that was sort of the universe of policies that actually mention heat. We're really around thermal comfort, followed by education about the effects of climate change and extreme heat, and then public health. And most of the policies are really focused on the public decision space. What can government do as opposed to what can businesses or families do? We found that very few policies actually address the impacts of extreme heat, and very few policies include specific measures for mitigating extreme heat, and very few actually make a connection between heat and health. Really briefly, again, as part of the needs assessment, we went out and talked to over 50 community members. We interviewed 37 community members in the Latino and the Native American communities here in Southern Nevada, and talked to 15 community leaders. We followed the one-on-one interviews with a survey. In the survey, almost 2/3 of those surveyed said they were very concerned about the risks posed by extreme heat. And we heard some great examples in public comment of the impacts of extreme heat or how people are actually feeling it. We also found, and this was somewhat surprising for us, that almost 2/3 are most likely to experience extreme heat in transit. And I'll come back to this point later. What we heard is we took their comments and sort of put them into 4 buckets to code whether they felt heat in indoors or the outdoors or in transit or in the workplace. And so what we heard from the folks interviewed is that they tend to experience heat indoors and outdoors and also during transit. Some of their major concerns about the impacts of extreme heat as it relates to health are dehydration and then the aggravation of underlying conditions such as asthma, and we heard that again in public comment. And finally, there's a lot of concern or mention of the impacts of extreme heat and how they manifest through energy use. So there's a lot of conversation around broken and inefficient air conditioning systems, and then also utility and AC maintenance expenses and bills. And I want to stop here to provide a real-life example of the connection between heat and health. I'm actually working with the Office of Food Security over at DHHS, and we just completed a survey of residents around the state of Nevada. We had over 1,000 responses, and we asked folks in the last 12 months if you've had difficulty buying food, why? And the number 2 response was utility bills. And so service providers are seeing that people do seek out emergency food resources during the summertime here in Southern Nevada, especially because they have to choose between paying for their AC bill, which as many of us know, are really high in the summer times, or buying food. So there is a real direct connection between heat and health. The funder also wanted to know specifically about how COVID had impacted folks through this lens of heat. Overall, we heard from community members that COVID had a negative impact on how people can mitigate their exposure to extreme heat. COVID exacerbated existing challenges and also presented new challenges. And some of the examples that they shared with us were that public and private spaces during COVID were not available. So a lot of people sort of in normal times tend to seek escape from the extreme heat by going to malls or going to the movie theaters, and a lot of those places were closed during COVID. We also heard that social service benefit programs were not available to undocumented individuals. We also discovered that a greater number of non-traditional workers were exposed to extreme heat. We tend to acknowledge that folks who work in construction or landscaping are sort of those that are normally affected or exposed to extreme heat. But during COVID, there was a whole new set of workers that we discovered were exposed to extreme heat. For example, we heard stories from retail workers who, had to stand in the back of the store 8 hours at a time filling cars coming through with their groceries. They had to then seek refuge from extreme heat in the refrigerator at the grocery store. So thinking about a whole new set of workers that are in fact exposed to extreme heat. Some of the policy gaps we identified after the conversations are that very few policies actually address extreme heat in the workplace or in transit decision spaces. Many community members do not know about the programs available to them, whether it's to repair an AC or to buy a smart appliance. Only 2 statutes currently address housing requirements as they relate to air conditioning units. There's an absence of programs that address repair or modernization of home or car air conditioning units. And finally, the solar roof programs are limited to homes and don't include apartments, townhomes, or condos. So we have a set of policy solutions that map to the policy gaps. Around the issue of information education, we recommend that there be a central website established with information about extreme heat. We recommend putting information about extreme heat and resources on Nevada 211. We also suggest the distribution of information about extreme heat resources and where to find resources, send it out through the schools. With respect to thermal comfort and transit, we would recommend weatherizing public transit stops, and that can include adding water bottle refilling stations, misters, et cetera, and to also use non-metal materials. We also recommend placing water bottle refilling stations in schools and social service agencies. With respect to policy solutions that address indoor thermal comfort indoors, we recommend expanding utility assistance programs and to revisit the income and citizenship status requirements, establish programs for home air conditioner replacement, repair, and car air conditioner replacement and repair, and to explore the expansion of solar roof programs to condominiums. With respect to the workplace, we recommend, or we would support the passage of Regulation R 05320, which Administrator Carrion will discuss later in this present, not here, but before you today. And then finally, with respect to public spaces, we would recommend expanding the tree canopy, and I know a couple of the public, members of the public also referenced tree canopy, and to adopt a cool roof and green street programs. With that, I'm happy to entertain any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brun, for that overview. We appreciate it. All right, we'll open it up to questions from members. And everyone, please bear with me because we're meeting in 2 physical locations and on Zoom. So members on Zoom, make sure to use the raise hand function so that we can identify you for questions. And if I start to miss anyone too long up in Carson City, let me or staff know, and we'll make sure to get to you. All right, questions for Dr. Brun? I see somebody up in Carson City. Go ahead. Senator Hansen.
Well, I thank you, Chair. Yeah, I have several questions, actually. My understanding is the biggest problem with the increase in temperatures is actually from infrared radiation, and the temperature increases are actually at night. It's the nighttime temperatures that have not gone down as much as they did traditionally, and that the daytime temperatures are actually fairly consistent. Yet most of your presentation sounded like daytime temperatures. So that's question 1. If all these people are working in the sunshine, that isn't where the problem is, according to the science. The other question I've got is in the governor's climate justice thing, which I've got a copy of, it says we want to replace or quit using, basically, all of the tools you just mentioned that are used in cooling, air conditioning, and so forth. It says specifically, these hydrofluoric carbons, et cetera, which are used in air conditioning units, refrigeration systems, foams, aerosols, and other applications are thousands of times more potent than CO2 and represent the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and globally. So, but your description is you want to increase the amount of air conditioning in all these spaces, yet at the same time the governor is trying to get us to reduce the amount of usage of these things because of the amount of pollution they are creating. So we have kind of a problem here. Now, can you address first the sunshine question, and secondly, why you're encouraging something that the governor's climate justice policies are clearly trying to cut back on?
Thank you for that, Senator Hansen. I believe I can answer your second question, which is that we are able to utilize air conditioning systems that have replacements for those hydrofluorocarbons. So I don't think anyone's suggesting the phasing out of air conditioning systems across the state. It's what's being used to chill the air that we're looking to address, and that's actually a national policy that's being implemented by the EPA to replace what's being used as some of those refrigerants.
Well, that's correct, Chair,
Dr. Brim,
but in fact, the governor did say that he wants to see these replaced in this report. So I'm glad you addressed that. I would like the person presenting the scientific report to explain how you can have both, because the stuff that you're talking about in replacement doesn't exist yet that I'm aware of, and I'm in that industry.
Dr. Brim, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Chairman Watts, through you to Senator Hansen. So thank you for the question, Senator Hansen. To your second question, I would acknowledge that your questions were beyond the scope of this report, in that we were not looking at sort of the science or the sort of the trade-off of use of air conditioning units. We were simply, that is what is in people's homes right now, and that is what they are using. And I think, as Chairman Watts said, there's a conversation about how to improve or address the concerns that you've identified. So I would just say that that sort of wading into that conversation was beyond the scope of this report. And to your first question, the data that we've looked at shows that both daytime and nighttime temperatures are rising. And one of the reasons that nighttime temperatures are rising, to your point, is for the same reasons that we're seeing sort of the temperatures the impacts of extreme heat in the daytime, and that with a lot of concrete and the urban heat islands, that sort of traps heat at night. And so I think the recommendations are to, by including or increasing tree canopy, having cool roof programs, less cement, et cetera, you would actually see a reduction in nighttime temperatures.
Okay, well, Mr. Chair, if I could follow up on that then. So you're actually calling on the city of Las Vegas to reduce the amount of expansion of asphalt and concrete. And now we just had a presentation in another committee where Las Vegas Water Authority is cutting back on all their green areas because it uses so much water. How, if we expand the tree canopy, are they going to be watered?
My understanding, I believe I don't want to speak for the water district, but I know there's been a conversation about using plants that are native and trees that are native to southern Nevada that would require less water.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Additional questions from committee members? Assemblyman Hafen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One quick question. At the beginning of the presentation, you said that we're talking about groceries and affordability, and the utility bills was the number 2. Do you happen to know what the number 1 response was? Thank you.
Nancy Brune, for the record. The number 1 was rising rent costs or rising housing prices.
Thank you. Additional questions from members? I do have one, Dr. Brune. I also saw recently that the Gwynn Center was involved in a study, I believe, with DRI and Nevada State College, looking a little bit more specifically at the impacts of health on the workforce. I know that we're going to have a presentation from business and industry about some of the work that they're undertaking to try and address that. But I was wondering if there's anything that you'd like to add. I know that's a separate study from the project that you just gave an overview of, but I was wondering if you wanted to speak at all to that and some of the findings that came out of that study.
Thank you, Chairman Watts. Again, that was really focused on the workforce, and one of the takeaways of the work was data heavy, but was to actually consider the adoption of the regulation that Administrator Carrion will talk about. Again, I think what we're learning is that there is just more workers than sort of we previously thought about that are exposed to extreme heat, whether it be folks who are working at grocery stores or folks who are driving, delivering groceries through Uber Eats, et cetera. So really taking action on this would be something that could help a greater number of workers other than those who just work in landscaping or construction.
Thank you. One of the things that I found that was really interesting is that we see the incidences of heat-related illness actually increase with the length of time that somebody has been employed in that field. In general, I just found it very interesting that there's still a lot that we really don't know about some of these impacts. And it seems like we're kind of on the cutting edge of beginning to uncover some of that data, but it just leaves more questions. For example, why is that? Is it a cumulative impact of heat on the workers over time, or is it kind of a cultural aspect of becoming more comfortable working in that, which we don't know? And so I think it points to the need for continued research in these areas, but also it points to some communities that we need to kind of I think prioritize some of our efforts when it comes to protecting. Members, any additional questions? All right. Seeing none, thank you again very much, Dr. Brim, for your presentation. That concludes agenda item number 3. We'll move on to our next item, which is an overview of excessive heat effects on workers' health and related regulations. We have joining us a representative from the Department of Business and Industry. Welcome, Ms. Carrion. You can go ahead and introduce yourself and proceed whenever you're ready. And please make sure that you have your microphone turned on.
Good morning, Chair Watts and Chair Peters, members of the Joint Committee. My name is Victoria Carrion, for the record. I am the Administrator at the Division of Industrial Relations. And our presentation today is about excessive heat effects on workers' health and our proposed heat illness regulation. So we've been looking at this issue for a couple of years now. We have found that heat illness is a growing problem in Nevada. And so this presentation will focus on a few things. What are the common heat-related illnesses and risk factors? How is heat affecting our Nevada workers? And which industries are most affected by heat illness? We'll also be talking about our response. We do have a proposed heat illness regulation. It's RO 5320. And there is a national emphasis program on heat illness that we just implemented effective yesterday on June 15th. So just to look at the health side of this, the most major heat illnesses that you experience out there in the workforce are heat stroke. This is the most life-threatening of all the heat illnesses. In this time, your body temperature can go to 103 degrees or higher. It's characterized by hot, red, dry, or damp skin. You have a very fast, strong pulse. Some of the other things you might be looking for is headache, dizziness, nausea, confusion. You can also pass out. If somebody is experiencing these symptoms, it's really a medical emergency where 911 needs to be called immediately. You need to move the person to a cooler place, try to lower their temperature, but you don't want to be giving them water. So that is definitely a life-threatening issue if you have heat stroke. There's also heat exhaustion. That's characterized by heavy sweating, cold, pale, and clammy skin, so there's some differences there. A fast, weak pulse, nausea or vomiting, muscle cramps, tiredness or weakness. You can also have dizziness or headache. You can also be passing out due to heat exhaustion. In this case, first aid, you should definitely move the person to a cool place, loosen your clothes. Wet cloths are also helpful. And in this case, you can sip water, but only in some small amounts, and definitely get medical help right away if you experience things like throwing up, or symptoms are getting worse, or they don't improve after an hour. There's other types of heat illnesses, such as heat cramps, etc., but those are the two major ones that I wanted to cover today. One of the things that's really important is that there are various risk factors that can make a person more susceptible to heat illness while they are on the job. So the level of exertion is a key thing, whether or not they're taking breaks, if they're doing something strenuous, what kind of medications are they taking and what kind of impact does that have, any underlying health conditions, other factors. You heard a lot, I think, in the public testimony about senior citizens who may have other age and other health factors. Any prior heat illness can have an impact. How much water you've been drinking, dehydration is a big issue, and acclimatization is also a major issue. And I think that federal OSHA has found that in the first 2 weeks of work, you're more apt to have a heat-related illness. So what does the data look like in Nevada? So in our division, we run Nevada OSHA, but we also have the workers' compensation section, which enforces Nevada's workers' compensation laws. So we collect all the data on all the workers' comp claims. And we have found that the number of workers' comp claims has actually been relatively flat over the last few years. This may be due to a variety of factors, including that there's a lot of underreporting of heat-related illnesses as a contributing factor to an injury, because somebody may just report it based on the actual impact of what happened. So for example, if somebody had a fall, that fall may have been precipitated by a heat-related issue, but the actual illness or injury that gets recorded is some sort of physical injury related to the fall. So that is what the workers' comp data looks like. If you look at the complaints that our office has received to OSHA for heat stress, you'll see that those have been rising quite significantly over the last 6 years. And you can see that the trends for northern versus southern Nevada. Obviously in southern Nevada, the number is much higher. So this is definitely a big driver for why we thought this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We also looked a bit as to which industries have the highest number of heat complaints. And it was very interesting to us that accommodation and food services was actually the #1 industry, followed by the retail trade. And so I think it's important to see that there are actually indoor and outdoor heat hazards that our workers are experiencing in Nevada. So it's not just like the construction trade or manufacturing, which you traditionally think of as exposed to heat injuries. Those are on this list, but they're much farther down. So in response to these issues, we have proposed a regulation to address heat illness. It's actually a very simple regulation that is we crafted based on a lot of stakeholder input, and it does two main things. It says if you have employees who are exposed to temperatures of 90 degrees or higher, you have to do two things. The first is you need to have a program for the management of heat illness, and the second is that you have to have training for all of your employees. So I'll go into a little bit more of what those two items look like. The first is the program for management of heat illness. So this has to be included within each business's written safety program, and that's a program that's already required under Nevada law for any business with more than 10 employees. So that program needs to include the big three that you've heard a lot about already: provision of water, rest breaks, provision of shade. Also, the plan needs to include how you're going to monitor employees for heat illness, how you monitor acclimatization during those first 14 days of employment. Like I said, that's when you're most at risk. Identification and mitigation of work processes, which may generate additional heat or humidity, like if you have a manufacturing process that creates additional heat, or you're in a kitchen that creates more heat and humidity. training, and procedures for responding to an emergency. I think the key on this program for management of heat illness is that every business has the ability to design it specific to their needs and to their concerns. So obviously the plan for a roofer is going to look really different than a plan for somebody who's operating a restaurant. The other element that's required under the proposed regulation is a training program. So we just have various elements that must be included in the training program. Working conditions that create the possibility of heat illness, an analysis of everybody needs to look at their own personal risk factors for heat illness, the importance of drinking water or electrolyte replacement drinks, the importance of acclimatization, as we discussed, the different types of heat illnesses, like I discussed, and the common signs and symptoms, the importance of reporting and any emergency procedures. And then supervisors also need to be trained on all of the things that I just mentioned, as well as procedures to follow when an employee exhibits heat symptoms, including any emergency procedures that need to be followed. So that is the proposed regulation. We are still working with stakeholders on final language for that. But in the meantime, since summer is upon us, we are implementing what federal OSHA has provided us, which is a national emphasis program, NEP for short, on heat illness. It was effective just yesterday. And so this is really an enforcement initiative to ensure that employers are taking heat illness issues into account. Because we don't have an enforceable standard specifically on heat in Nevada yet, we will be using the general duty clause to determine whether a citation is appropriate. And the general duty clause under Nevada law really just says that employers have a duty to ensure that their workplace is free of hazards and they are addressing any hazards that are identified. And obviously heat in Nevada is a recognized hazard. So what does this do? So on heat priority days, which are 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, basically Nevada OSHA can provide technical assistance to industries that are targeted as high risk. We can also respond to complaints and referrals and fatalities no matter what the industry is, and engaging in proactive outreach. And then on heat warning or heat advisory days, which are declared by the National Weather Service, on those days we can conduct programmed, which are pre-planned inspections in targeted high-risk industries, and there's about 70 industries on the list. So federal OSHA provided the framework for this national emphasis program. A couple of changes that we made here in Nevada is that their threshold was 80 degrees. We changed it to 90 degrees given Nevada's climate and the lack of humidity that we have here. We thought 90 degrees was more appropriate based on our analysis. And then within the high-risk industries, we also added accommodation and food service industries, specifically casinos, given that we had had a lot of complaints in that area. There is some federal effort to create a standard for heat illness as well. They are in the pre-rulemaking stage at this point, gathering input. And if a federal regulation is adopted, Nevada OSHA, as a state plan state, has the obligation of either adopting the federal standard as is within 60 days or put an alternative standard in place within 60 days that is at least as effective as the federal standard. So if Nevada, if we are able to adopt the regulation that we have discussed, that would be Nevada's standard. We wouldn't have to adopt the federal standard as long as we can show that the impact of the Nevada standard is at least as effective as what the federal government proposes. So the other thing that I wanted to mention before we close is that Nevada SCATS, which is our safety consultation and training section, provides free consultation services to businesses. We especially assist small businesses, so if a business needs to help develop their plan or develop their training program related to heat illness, our team is ready and willing to assist. We're also going to be providing heat illness training online and in person as well. And so I've provided some contact information for Nevada SCATS in our presentation as well. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And I just want to briefly start by thanking you. I've heard a bit about the process and the stakeholder engagement, and just appreciate the time that's been taken to get feedback and work on modifying the language of the regulation, so that we have something that is impactful, but that also works for the diverse businesses across the state, which you spoke to, and also kind of puts education at the forefront. It is interesting that we're kind of just now getting to the point of addressing heat issues in the workplace. But I'm glad that we're working on making sure that employers and employees are educated about some of these potential risks and how to mitigate them, and applaud our state for being out in front of the federal government in terms of working on this issue. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions from members. Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Thank you, Chair Watts. Thank you for being here. A quick question, this training, would it be part of the OSHA training or would it be just an internal training? And if it's internal, who would be overseeing that it's being completed?
Thank you, Victoria Carrion. For the record, Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Gorlow. So the training is not part of the OSHA 10 classes, which I think is what you were referring to. It would be a separate training that each employer is required to do, just as they are required to train on various hazards that they have within their business. So there is no set oversight as to exactly what that training curriculum would need to include, other than what we have included in the draft regulation, which is just some guidelines of the topics that need to be discussed. So there's no set oversight of exactly what each business would need to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll go to Assemblywoman Hafen, and then we'll go to Assemblywoman Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I spent my early career laying pipe in 115-degree weather, so I know that heat is fun to work in. And I'm just curious, which state, you mentioned you're working with stakeholders to help draw up these regulations. Could you tell us which stakeholders specifically you've been working with?
Thank you for the question, Victoria Carrion, for the record, through you, Chair, to Assemblyman Hafen. So we have worked with a variety of stakeholders, chambers of commerce, as well as the construction industry. We've had specifically industrial hygienists who are safety experts. We have had a variety of meetings with a variety of stakeholders. We've also conducted some more informal meetings as well.
Mr. Chair, I'm just curious, like specifically you mentioned chambers and a variety of people. Could you maybe get back to us with a specific list of who you've been talking to? Because variety of people just seems very vague to me.
Thank you, Victoria Carrion, for the record. I'm happy to provide a list of all of the stakeholders that we've engaged with.
Thank you, and we'd appreciate that. I know that there have been members, particularly of the business community, that have been interested in crafting the language and making sure it works. So, and I'm sure that's been covered again in both in formal meetings as well as some of your informal meetings as well. So, if you can provide that with the committee, we'd appreciate it. We'll go on to Assemblywoman Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you for the presentation. And Mr. Chair, I appreciate your comments about the essential that we educate the population. But I want to make sure that our education is accurate. And I need to ask you where you got what science data, what medical journal did you get the formula or the recommendations for the treatment for heat stroke? You mentioned do not give the person anything to drink. And with my hundreds of hours of ER training and literally being out in the heat and mountain climbing, et cetera, one of the things that you do is you do try to hydrate them. Little sips of not water per se, because water will make the problem worse, but some electrolyte solution or something like that. So I'm concerned about what you're giving to the community, what you're giving to workers, and where your data is coming from. If you could tell me what journals you're using. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Victoria Carrion, for the record, through you, Chair, to Senator Titus. So that information actually came from the CDC, and so I'm happy to provide a link to where that information came from.
Right, so
Thank you, and sorry, let me just step in here. First of all, you can go directly to the member, and all presenters can go directly to the member if it's easier for you. I just also wanted to clarify to Dr. Titus's question. I think one of the concerns is that providing water to someone once they've reached the stage of heat stroke as the Assemblywoman mentioned, actually can cause worse problems because of the electrolyte issues. And that's probably, I'm guessing, what's reflected in the CDC's guidance.
If I'll follow up, if I might, Mr. Chair. So the reality is
Go ahead.
There's different levels to this, and I think it would really be important that if we're going to educate the population, especially the employer and the employee, you want to make sure that that data and your information is as accurate as possible. And so making sure that they understand the three different levels, right? First, we'll see maybe cramping. That would be the first level. The second one is that heat exhaustion that you mentioned. And then the final one is that heat stroke based on symptoms, tachycardia, temperature. But at that time, we still, if they're able to swallow, we would still encourage them to be drinking electrolytes. If you're out in a rural area and it's 30 minutes before EMS gets to you, you can still cool them down, but at the same time, if they're alert, you'd want to make sure they're drinking an electrolyte solution. So again, if you really want to help the employees, you really need to give them, first preemptively, we need to understand how to prevent it, which some of your solutions are great, but there's other things we could be doing. So I just want to make sure that education component is as accurate as possible, and using a blanket CDC statement sometimes doesn't really address what those issues are. Assuming you're in Clark County and you have EMS there in just a moment who could start an IV and give them an electrolyte solution may not be really applicable when you're out in a rural Nevada and you're working in a field. What do you do there? So I'm just concerned about what I'm seeing in your presentation. Hopefully what you have is a little bit more accurate than what you presented to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Titus. And again, I think that's one of because there's a wide range of communities and industries across the state. I think the goal here is to have a broad framework that each employer can customize to their situation. And I think you and I both agree that the ultimate goal is to avoid someone reaching the point of heat stroke, which is life-threatening whenever possible, so that we don't have to take into account some of those finer points at that stage. I believe that we have Senator Hansen. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Real quick correction, though. You mentioned this is a new issue for Nevada to be addressing. Actually, I've been in construction for 40 years. We've been addressing it since I began in construction. There's absolutely nothing new about heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and our industry, at least, has been on top of that. And if you would call it cutting edge, we've been. Back to the presentation, Nevada heat stress workers' compensation claims. There's I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of workers in Nevada. If you multiply the number of workers by 365 days, the fact that we only had less than 100 claims in the entire state, that seems to be a little bit of we're making more out of this than really there. The heat stress complaints to Nevada OSHA, a grand total of 202 out of hundreds of thousands of workers. I mean, and this is some big giant thing that we need to drag 70 industries into and come up with a whole set of new regulations. That's crazy. The last question, actually, a question is, of the top 4, you list under Nevada OSHA heat complaints by industry, the top 4 are almost all inside workers. They don't work outside. You know, you look at construction like myself, we work outside most of the time. Virtually everybody, though, on this list are inside people. Are you suggesting we increase the amount of air conditioning in these units? I mean, this isn't global warming that people are thinking of, where it's the sun that's baking the poor worker out there. These are indoor industries that, by percentage, are obviously the overwhelming problem.
Thank you for the question, Victoria Carrion, for the record, to Senator Hansen. So, yes, absolutely. As I mentioned during my presentation, we have found that indoor heat is a major issue in Nevada. I think it is definitely compounded in the summer because sometimes air conditioning systems are strained when you're in a restaurant, for example, and you have a lot of heat going on in the restaurant and it's hot outside. So I think the confluence of the environmental heat and the indoor heat can kind of collide during those times. Sometimes in these industries, there is a combination of indoor and outdoor work, especially transportation and warehousing. You may be going in and outside, so there could be a combination there. But we would absolutely agree that indoor heat is a major concern.
All right, so basically we need to expand the amount of air conditioning that these people work under. I got it. That, again, that conflicts with what the governor called for. So anyway, when I look at this 200 complaints out of hundreds of thousands of workers working 365 days a year, we're making a mountain out of a molehill, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hansen. We also don't have, extremely large outbreaks of different diseases, and it's because we also train and try and avoid the spread of those diseases through some of our occupational programs. So I think the goal of this, again, is to protect public health by making sure we get out in front of some of these issues. To that, though, I'd like to ask a quick follow-up, and this kind of also points back to the previous presenter. You mentioned it a bit, but do you have a sense of some of the data gaps, some of the underreporting and other missing data when it comes to this issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in answer to your question, Victoria Carrion for the record. So yes, we do believe there's quite a bit of data gaps. First of all, if you're making a heat illness complaint, that's a voluntary thing, obviously. So there's a lot of people who are not submitting complaints. We have heard that there's concerns among workers who may be undocumented and don't want to submit complaints. So we know that that's one factor out there. We also know that oftentimes, as I was mentioning earlier, that there are injuries that may be caused with an underlying heat component, but that part does not get reported. And so we know that there are definitely some data gaps.
Thank you. One of the things that I think is often discussed is that high temperatures can actually have impacts on cognition and mental health. And so I know you had mentioned earlier that that may be a contributing factor to a fall or another incident. Have you done any analysis to see if there's a relation between kind of workplace incidents or injuries and kind of either the general temperature or heat conditions, or is that another kind of gap that we have in our understanding of these issues?
Victoria Carrion for the record, Mr. Chair, that would be a very interesting analysis, but we have not yet conducted that.
All right, we'll put it onto the to-do list. I believe next we have a question from Vice Chair Doñate, then we'll go to Assemblywoman Hansen.
Thank you so much, Chair Watts. And of course, thank you so much for the presentation. As a side note, my siblings are landscapers and one of them fainted twice last year. So definitely relevant. I guess my two questions that I have, the first is, in the provisions that you're writing, is there any requirement that these programs have to be language accessible to the employees of what they're proficient in? And then my second question would be, I love this presentation. I like the fact that we're talking about the protection of employees that work outside. In the future, are you considering also similar programs for air quality and folks that have to be disproportionately affected from this issue? I know we always talk about heat, but I'm interested in hearing your perspective on air quality.
Thank you, Senator Victoria Carrion, for the record. So in answer to your question, there is a general OSHA requirement that all training provided to employees does need to be in the language that they understand. So yes, the training would need to be in a language that is accessible to them. And then in terms of air quality, we did issue some guidance. We don't have a regulation related to air quality, but we did issue guidance on May 3rd, I believe, regarding wildfire smoke. Yes, May 3rd. So it's on our website, and I'm happy to send a link to the committee. But it's on wildfire smoke as well, and includes the different air particulate levels and what kind of action you should be taking for your employees. So it includes some guidance for businesses as they're going into the wildfire smoke season.
All right. Thank you. We'll go on to Assemblywoman Hansen.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. Actually, the good senator here in the north took I got some of my questions answered already. We own a construction company, a plumbing company, full mechanical, so sometimes deal with the cooling side as well and heating. So of course your slide number 8 grabbed my attention when I saw for OSHA heat complaints, the construction trades were at about 4.5% of your reporting, where, again, the accommodation and the retail were, and the food services were at the higher end of the spectrum. So that caught my attention. Now, in the north here, we not only deal with hot, but we deal with some extreme cold temperatures. So are we also going to look into the cold impact that employees have as part of this hearing today?
Thank you, Assemblywoman Victoria Carrion, for the record. So obviously cold temperatures could have a definite negative impact on worker health. And so under the general duty clause of Nevada OSHA, those workers, those employers who have employees who are exposed to very cold temperatures also already have a duty to try to mitigate those hazards, and they already should be part of their workplace safety program. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And yes, having had a business that deals with all kinds of weather-related conditions and occupational hazards, for 36 years, we've conformed to, what those are and some common sense measures as well, because we care about our employees. I have a son-in-law who has a 3-person landscaping company in northern Nevada, and so deals with the heat and the opposite end of the extreme of single-digit temperatures and tremendous amounts of snow removal. So while I appreciate the opportunity here today, I am worrying that we're trying to find solutions to problems that are so minute, and that we are spending all this time doing it, but I'm open to having the conversation, but certainly glad to see the numbers are not so extreme considering the density of the population in southern Nevada in particular. Thank you for the opportunity, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman. And, we appreciate you and the Senator being proactive, and I think want to make sure that everyone shares in following some of those best practices. One question that I did want to ask real quickly, because it's been brought up a couple times, the indoor and outdoor, and you kind of mentioned, and I just want to get some clarity on this. You mentioned when workers are exposed to temperatures of 90 degrees. So that's not necessarily that this kicks in whenever the outdoor temperature is 90 degrees, but for example, someone may be working in a kitchen or in another environment indoors, where they might be exposed even year-round to temperatures in excess of 90 degrees. So am I correct that it's what the worker is exposed to and not what the thermometer reads outside that kind of determines having, again, a training program in place and a guideline of how to ensure that heat doesn't reach negative levels for the worker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Victoria Carrion, for the record. That is all correct.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod.
Thank you, Chair Watts. I'm kind of going to piggyback on what you asked about the numbers of accommodations, food service, retail, trade. So I'm guessing that's a year-round thing, like he said, not just what the temperature is outside. But I'm also curious, as someone who personally had heat exhaustion, I am tremendously affected by the heat because of that. And my doctor has said that, because once you have, are you seeing a lot of repeats when you, is my understanding correct that that's a normal thing? So once you've had heat stroke or heat exhaustion, you're much more likely to have that happen again?
Yes, Assemblywoman. In my slide that I talked about the heat illness risk factors, you see that prior heat illness is definitely one of those factors that we think employers should train their employees on so that they are aware that they would be at greater risk.
Thank you. I believe Assemblyman Ellison has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like all the comments that was brought forward. I also am in the construction and raised on ranches most of my life. And if you want to get hot, get on a horse and get out in the middle of nowhere. You'll find out what heat is. But in the construction, we're in the construction also in commercial and residential. So we're out there all seasons long. I mean, we're moving snow, we're trying to chip ice, but mostly in the construction trade in the wintertime, our people know what they're going to be facing before they even go out there that day. But instead of creating another law and regulation, wouldn't it be best that OSHA just says, okay, here's a place card you could put where the employees are with all the regulations combined with federal and state. Why don't you just make a chart and put it out for every employee to see on the day-to-day basis when they go to work, instead of putting more onto the OSHA regulations that will do when they go to get their 40 and their 8 hours. Wouldn't that be easier to do?
Thank you for the question, Victoria Carrion, for the record. Certainly a poster like what you are explaining would be a great resource for employees. The reason that we think a regulation would be helpful is because in the absence of one, there's not as much clarity as to exactly what employers should be doing. And so we think this provides greater clarity for both the employers and the employees about what is required, as well as from the OSHA perspective, it makes it clearer in terms of our enforcement efforts to know when we see a violation or not. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, just to get some clarity, this would not be incorporated into some of the overall, the OSHA 10 trainings. This would just be, again, something to make sure that employers are giving an overview of employees, that they, what to expect and potential symptoms so that they can recognize heat illness, and then making sure that they have a basic plan in place if a worker is experiencing those things to provide some shade, water, a break from some of the heat conditions so that they can cool down. Is that correct?
Victoria Carrion, for the record, Mr. Chair, that is correct. The OSHA 10 training that has been discussed, that is a specific curriculum that is mandated by federal OSHA. So this is in addition to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then one other thing that I just wanted to ask, we've heard about workman's comp, and there's obviously costs to those incidents. There's also costs to decrease productivity if folks are suffering from physical or mental impacts as related to exposure from excessive heat. So really, and again, it sounds like many, but not all businesses already have plans to address these, and essentially any cost associated with providing water or shade and some of these mitigation measures can also be balanced against the costs of the incidents that happen when heat gets out of control. I guess that's not really a question so much as a remark when we consider some of these things. Are there any other questions from members? All right, seeing none, thank you very much again for the time in your presentation today. That concludes agenda item number 4. We will now go to agenda item number 5, which is a presentation on urban heat mitigation programs in other states. We have Ms. Moen from the Nature Conservancy joining us. Welcome. Once you have your presentation ready to go, you can introduce yourself for the record and proceed whenever ready.
Thank you, Chair Watts. My name is Jana Moen, and I'm the External Affairs Director for the Nature Conservancy in Nevada. Chair Peters and Chair Watts and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today to talk about urban heat mitigation programs that TNC is working on in other states. The Nature Conservancy is a global NGO with a mission to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We have chapters in all 50 states and have conservation programs in over 70 countries worldwide. We use a science-based, collaborative, place-based approach. The advantage of being part of such a large organization with a broad mission is that we are able to tackle a wide range of issues in different places. TNC has urban conservation programs in many U.S. cities, and today I'm going to provide highlights of programs that seek to address the issue of urban heat in 5 cities: Denver, Houston, Louisville, New York, and Phoenix. Most of the programs in these cities have a component that's focused on expanding urban tree canopy to serve the function as natural cooling infrastructure. This diagram here shows the cooling effect that an urban tree canopy can have in our cities by providing shade where people work, travel, and live. And trees have other benefits too. They can serve as habitat for wildlife and birds, they sequester carbon, and they provide a connection to nature for people in cities, which has positive benefits for human health and well-being. I included this slide to illustrate the point that there are significant temperature differences in the shade versus unshaded areas. In this example, there is a 14-degree temperature difference in shaded versus unshaded areas. It was pointed out to me that this is an air temperature monitor and its readings are sensitive to direct sun. So to fully measure temperature for understanding heat impacts, it's important to measure land surface temperatures. To illustrate why land surface temperatures are important, I added this slide to illustrate how surfaces can reflect and absorb heat. My presentation today is focused on urban tree canopy, but I added a few slides after receiving a little bit of feedback to note that another heat mitigation strategy in urban areas is to use cool roofs and pavement that can reflect that sunlight instead of absorbing it into the surfaces where it stays hot. So in Louisville, Kentucky, the Nature Conservancy kicked off the Green Heart Project in 2017. It is a multi-year health study to understand the benefits of urban greenery to human health. The researchers first measured baseline risk of diabetes and heart disease, stress levels, and the strength of social ties in 700 participants from targeted Louisville neighborhoods, and also took baseline assessments and measurements of air pollution levels at the same time. Now, the team is in process of planting thousands of trees, plants, and shrubs throughout the neighborhoods to create an urban ecosystem that promotes physical activity while decreasing noise, stress, and air pollution. They have already planted several thousand trees by asking neighborhood residents if they will host a tree in their yard and teaching them how to care for it. The 700 participants will receive annual checkups to evaluate how increasing greenery has affected their physical and mental health and their social ties. This program is focused on human health and outcomes for enhancing urban greenery. And while combating urban heat was not the primary goal, it is certainly a co-benefit. In New York City, the Nature Conservancy mapped tree canopy and heat vulnerability. They found that trees are not evenly distributed across the city. The most heat vulnerable neighborhoods tend to be low-income communities or communities of color with less tree cover. Another gap they discovered is that there is no dedicated long-term funding or committed plan for managing this resource in the years ahead. To address these problems, the Conservancy launched Future Forest NYC, an initiative to assure the future of New York City urban forest and the social and environmental benefits it provides in a just, equitable way. There are three components to Future Forest NYC. First, collecting and communicating the science of tree canopy. TNC compiled updated science on our on the city's urban tree canopy into a State of the Urban Forest report, and this serves as a baseline document to measure program effectiveness. Next, TNC convened a leadership coalition called Forest for All NYC, which is a diverse coalition of government agencies, businesses, and NGOs who are supporting urban forestry efforts using a collectively adopted urban forest agenda. And third, TNC participates in and coordinates stewardship efforts across the city to implement the forest agenda and educate and engage people in its activities. In Houston, the Conservancy worked with Harris County Public Health Department, the City of Houston, and the Houston Advanced Research Center to organize the largest single-day community-led heat mapping effort in history to develop neighborhood-by-neighborhood temperature maps of the region. The mapping effort was part of a larger program called Heat Watch, led by Kappa Strategies and supported by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Program Office. To complete the mapping, citizen scientist volunteers traveled along prescribed routes to record ambient temperatures and humidity at 3 specific times during the day. The project volunteers covered 32 mapping areas or polygons that represent a 10 square mile area. The data they collected is open source and available to the public. To better understand where the most heat vulnerable communities are, temperature data was overlaid with data from the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. The map on the bottom right of the screen, the blue areas represent higher vulnerability. The Conservancy has used this information to help target the neighborhoods where heat action is most needed, and it has informed the development of community greening master plans for those communities. A second mapping effort is planned for 2023. In Denver, the Conservancy's mapping efforts also revealed that wealthy neighborhoods have an average of 7 times more trees than poor neighborhoods. Together with partners, TNC has been working with local communities in the Denver neighborhoods to plant more trees and find holistic solutions for expanding the tree canopy across the city. Key to TNC's approach in Denver is advocating for successful ballot measures that raised the city's sale tax to support climate resiliency for the city. They included measures to embark on transformative heat mitigation. In 2018, Ballot Measure 2A was passed to raise a tax levy to support climate resiliency. Some of this funding can be used for trees in the public right-of-way and trees in parks. And then in 2020, Ballot Measure 2A was revisited again. Overall, the measure will generate $40 to $45 million per year for climate resilience, workforce development, environmental justice, and climate justice programs, as well as workforce development. There are a few things that ultimately help supporting the community included in this effort, and that is really focused on community outreach and engagement. Currently, through this measure, the city can provide grants for organizations and for individuals. Individuals can apply to serve as climate ambassadors, to do outreach and climate-related engagement in any of 5 different climate-related areas, and one of those areas is urban forestry. Also, Denver just hired its first urban forester this year. In Phoenix, the Conservancy's mapping effort revealed that the hottest neighborhoods have the highest child poverty rates and lowest tree canopy cover. TNC contributed to the heat action planning efforts in the targeted Phoenix neighborhoods, and there's a presentation on the Phoenix Heat Action Program, so I won't go into too many details here about that, but I will say that one of the efforts that TNC is really engaged with in Phoenix is the development and implementation of the Urban Heat Academy. Now in its second year, this is a bilingual program that works with organizations to identify leaders in the communities to teach them about nature-based solutions, and also teach them how to effectively advocate to government leaders about heat mitigation. They are able to practice telling their story about what their community needs, and they are given resources to help them contact their policymakers and become part of that solution. The Academy uses a heat curriculum that's developed by a heat team. And at the end of the day, the last day culminates in a tree planting effort where they learn about tree planting in their community with an actual tree planting event. Just to highlight some common threads among these programs all had a heat mapping effort, which revealed health equity issues and heat equity issues. So I think as we address heat issues in our Nevada cities, this is also a way that we can address nature inequity issues. Many people in disadvantaged communities don't have access to nature, and nature has so many benefits for human health and well-being, as that slide a few slides ago demonstrated. It's good for social networks, it's good for cleaning air quality, but nature inequity continues to remain an issue, as some of these mapping exercises have generated. So I added an important bullet point to this slide about the need and opportunity to address issues of nature inequity as we start to look at heat mitigation efforts. Also, these programs all focused on community engagement and empowerment. Finally, dedication of long-term funding and a committed long-term plan for monitoring and maintenance is necessary in all of these programs for successful urban tree canopy programs. Finally, just some lessons learned for reducing heat in Nevada cities. My original presentation just had Las Vegas, but I realized that Reno is certainly a very fast warming city as well. And I will say in our exploration of this at the Conservancy here in Nevada, there's a lot of mapping that has been done and is currently being done. And there's several existing programs and goals that I'm aware of. For example, earlier this year, Las Vegas Mayor Carolyn Goodman announced that the city of Las Vegas was launching a tree initiative, which has the goal of planting 60,000 trees in the city by 2050. Another example is the goal that the NGO Impact Nevada adopted, and they have a goal to plant 100,000 trees in Las Vegas by 2050, and I'm sure there are others. I also added a bullet here, which is a suggestion that establishing an urban greening equity goal can help address heat issues and also connect people to nature by planting drought-tolerant trees and vegetation close to where they live, work, and travel. Everyone has a right to enjoy and experience the multiple benefits of nature, and this is a great way to address historic inequities and bring everyone along. Third, heat planning should be prioritized and focused in neighborhoods that are experiencing the worst impacts of heat. We can learn where those are from our mapping efforts. And then another thing I think that is important takeaway is it's important to invest in urban tree programs. The legislature could consider establishing a climate resiliency fund like Colorado's to support activities like urban forestry and other climate resiliency measures that are beneficial for both our cities and our rural areas. And then finally, we need to find a way to put trees and solar panels on parking lots in our cities. These parking lots are big black surfaces that suck in heat, like the one that is shown on the screen. Our cars bake in this heat all day long, and then we expend even more energy and carbon dioxide to cool them down. A simple solution that could generate renewable energy is to cover our parking lots with trees and solar panels. A good example of this can be found now at the Springs Preserve in Las Vegas. They have a beautiful parking lot there, and I have it pictured there on the bottom of the screen. It's actually quite enjoyable to be in. Kudos to you, Spring Preserve. With that, I'm happy to take any questions and comments, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Mohn. All right, first up we have Senator Hardy, and then we will go to Assemblywoman Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at your presentation and I see all of these wonderful trees. I look outside and I see all these wonderful trees and I see grass and trees, and from the gist of your presentation, it sounded like we need more trees, we need more green, and it's a time where we're in this drought and people are accusing, maybe not the right word, but saying that some little cities in Clark County are using more water because of the trees and because of the grass. And so are you proposing that we take grass and trees away, or are you proposing that we plant more and use more water to treat them with? And the type of trees that I've heard in the presentation, we're going to have more desert compatible trees, except you and I know that those don't give much shade. It's a leading question.
Oh, thank you for the question, Assemblyman Hardy. For the record, Jana Mohn. This is true. Trees do require water, but if planned right, urban canopy in cities can have a higher return on investment as natural infrastructure because they also move. A lot of times, the cities and the buildings and the concrete it traps humidity as well as trapping water. And trees have a more efficient way of cooling down the area around them overall. And then I think that the Southern Nevada Water Authority has thought about this idea of trees for a long time and has thought about the trade-offs that you have with water use and water savings and trees and turf. And we've been having those conversations about turf removal, especially now it's ongoing, non-functional turf removal. And I think there's a very distinct difference between lawns that require a lot of water and some trees that can be part of your hydrological system that's part of your city. And so the Southern Nevada Water Authority does produce a tree selection and care guide, and they have a regional plant list that folks can use. And I think while it may not seem like some of those trees provide shade, I think if you were to, Assemblyman, walk in some of those shaded paths, even if they're screwbean mesquite trees or some other drought-tolerant plant, you will find a significant cooling effect that occurs. And if you do that across a larger shaded tree canopy, you can organize it and design it so that it works with the water demand in your environment, and that certainly needs to be planned.
So you're not claiming that you want fewer trees or trees taken out and replaced with other trees?
I think that we should have a responsible urban tree canopy that provides shade and is beneficial for our desert environment and suitable for that. So if some trees need to be removed, either because they are water hogs or they are otherwise pesky pollen, could produce pesky pollen or something like that, then I think that's a decision for some of these administrators to make. But I certainly am not. I'm certainly advocating for more trees.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go on to, I believe, Assemblywoman Hanson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Moen. A couple of questions. I'd like you to answer for the record. There were some claims that were made. I never really thought I'd see, I've heard some real interesting conversations in this building, but I never thought I'd really hear conversations about trees and undertones of neighborhood against neighborhood, that there might be some sort of discrimination going on. I am what you would consider an at-risk youth growing up, raised by a single mom in a single white trailer in Sun Valley, Nevada. Certainly, there were a lot of trees where I lived. But some of the claims you made about the impoverished areas and less trees, I want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding. Are we trying to claim that municipalities are discriminating in some of these areas by not providing trees along sidewalks, or that there aren't parks with trees? Are we claiming that those who provide affordable housing are not providing trees or green belts for these served communities, or, impoverished as I was growing up?
Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman Hanson. For the record, my name is Jana Moen. I'm not trying to put blame on anybody for a situation that we observed in our mapping, which was that there are more trees in affluent neighborhoods have more trees than underserved neighborhoods, and several of those maps identified that pattern. The maps were generated using data from CDC social vulnerability, from using child poverty rates, so different data sources, and they reveal a similar issue when overlaid with existing urban tree canopy. I don't think that we need to pit neighborhoods against neighborhoods, but I think we need to be, as we think about our heat resiliency and planning efforts for climate, I think we need to think about how those neighborhoods that have been underserved or disadvantaged in the past can be brought along with that effort and included and enfolded in that effort. And if we notice an issue that there are more trees in more affluent neighborhoods, then I think if we're trying to cool an area and there's higher heat problems in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, then that helps us identify where we need to focus our efforts. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Could I quickly follow up to that?
Yes, but let me just add something real quick. I'd be glad next time you're in town, Assemblywoman, and I know you're familiar with Southern Nevada, to take you out to downtown Summerlin, where they relatively new development that has already got extremely mature shade-providing, drought-tolerant trees, and then take you over to East Las Vegas on Sahara and Nellis, where I grew up, where there's significantly less tree cover. And again, I don't think it's necessarily an issue of discriminatory intent, but development codes, standards, technologies have changed over time. And some of these older communities, have been left behind, and it's a mix of governmental decisions as well as just, what individual properties have done and have decided to do over the years. So next time you come down, I'd love to show you some of the differences that have been revealed through some of this mapping. Go ahead and follow up.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd be glad to take you up on that. My great-grandfather was the sheriff of Lincoln County in the late 1800s, which included Clark, and on horseback. So, I have family and roots from southern Nevada, so I get it, but I would love to do a visit. I just wanted to clarify this report. We didn't show any mapping of Nevada cities. It was your references were Denver, Colorado, Houston, Texas, Louisville, Kentucky, New York City, New York, and Phoenix, Arizona, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I did not show you mapping that we have done. The Nature Conservancy has mapped land surface temperatures in Las Vegas. We did that in 2020. But I would also like to point you to a really wonderful report that was done by the Lindsay Institute out of UNLV in 2020. They looked at heat inequities in Las Vegas and Reno. And I'm happy to provide the committee with a link to that report, but it was well done. So some of that mapping has been done, but we have not done the full exercise here in our Nevada chapter of overlaying tree canopy to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And yes, Ms. Moen, if you could please provide some of that as follow-up materials for the committee, we'd greatly appreciate it. I know that, many studies have been done, and I forget if those that you mentioned also overlap with some of the efforts that the RTC and some of the local governments have done to map heat islands, at least here in southern Nevada. So to anyone listening who's been involved in some of those mapping efforts, if you can provide some of those as follow-up materials to the committee for our information, that'd be very helpful. I believe we have a question from Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Thank you, Chair Watts. I'm really excited to hear that the City of Las Vegas is planning on doing 60,000 trees. I think that's amazing. And then with Reno also going more bee-friendly, I'm sure these are some issues that they're looking at as well. But my question is, and I might be putting the cart before the horse, but have there been conversations about who's going to take care of these trees for pruning, disease, pests, any of that? Who's going to take care of them?
Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman Gorlow. Jana Moen for the record. Those are great conversations that need to be had, and that's, I think, the highlight of some of those programs that I have mentioned in my presentation is that the court have worked and coordinated with community organizations, with health organizations, with cities and counties to have those conversations and to establish those long-term plans for care and maintenance. And because certainly that does take time, that is why long-term planning and investment is needed. Trees live a long time, and their care and maintenance, especially during the first few years after being planted and they're growing up to their full mature height, is critically important. But it's also a wonderful, amazing way to engage community members and neighborhood associations and citizens in those communities in the health of their own neighborhood and in the appreciation of their own neighborhood as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe we have a question from Assemblyman Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is quite interesting. Urban bursts and rules is my question. Do you have any idea how much water a standard tree takes a day?
For the record, Jana Moen, Assemblyman Ellison, I believe that varies on the tree species.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
To answer your question, the amount of water that a tree needs from day to day varies by the tree species. And so I don't know specific numbers, but that's why those resources that I previously noted, like the regional plant list from SNWA and the Southern Nevada Plant Guide, are really helpful for understanding and planning water requirements for trees.
The reason I ask this, in some of the rural areas, the wildlife is being affected by lack of water. So by pruning these trees in some of these areas, that fills that aquifer back up. And I was surprised how much a juniper trees it took a day water. So I was hoping maybe you could answer that, because the juniper tree out into these areas, they had to prune quite a bit of areas in 2 counties. So to get that aquifer back up, to get more water to farming, to ranching, to wildlife in general. So I'm hoping maybe we can get an answer to that in the near future. Thank you.
Okay, for the record, Jana Moan, Assemblyman Ellison, I'm happy to follow up with an answer about the water use and requirements of juniper trees.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Moen. And I'd just like to note that these are real complex issues that we're running into when we look at kind of the intersection of trying to transition to clean energy, and addressing some of these things may increase energy use. We're looking at water usage, which of course is another scarce resource, and then dealing with heat. And so just to note that these are complex issues that we're dealing with, and a lot of different things that we have to take into consideration. I believe we have a question from Assemblywoman Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for acknowledging me. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. So I'm a tree lover, and I would describe myself as a tree hugger. I plant trees, and any property I've ever owned, I have planted trees. But what the species are really is determined by where that particular property is. And we have a really good program already in the state of Nevada, and I haven't heard you acknowledge it. And I'm concerned that we're living in silos in the state frequently, and one department doesn't talk to another department. Our Nevada Division of Forestry has a nursery, and most of it is grown in southern Nevada, and then they bring them up to Washoe Lake, where when I've planted a tree in my properties, I go to that nursery and get a native plant, or one that we know is acclimated and will survive in this part of the state. Where is the association? Are you working with our Nevada Division of Forestry? I haven't heard you mention them at all. And then I have a follow-up, Mr. Chair, if that's okay.
Thank you for the question. For the record, Jana Moan. Thank you, Assemblywoman Titus, and I'm glad to hear that you are a tree hugger. Likewise, I am too. And yes, thank you so much for mentioning the Nevada Division of Forestry. They have an amazing program. The nursery programs are really amazing, and several of our staff do coordinate with them. But we've also recently been talking with Nevada Division of Forestry about an urban tree canopy program, and beginning to form the beginnings around that with others in Southern Nevada, other stakeholders like the Southern Nevada Water Authority and the RTC. And we have been engaging with NDS and their urban tree program on planning that program. I didn't include much of a mention about the activities that we have in Las Vegas because I was asked to present on activities in other states, but I'm happy to share more information about that fledgling urban tree program that we are currently working on.
Well, thank you for that, because I'd really like to see what you actually are doing, because we certainly know that the trees that I've planted, say Fremont's cottonwoods and Russian olives and willows, are certainly not something you're going to plant in southern Nevada, but they thrive up here, especially in the locations that I happen to have to plant them. And I'm concerned that we're not hearing what's best for Las Vegas. And I have gone to Las Vegas, and I appreciate Chairman Watts offering a tour to Assemblywoman Hanson. However, I think we've all been to Las Vegas, and we certainly know that. And I think we should be giving credit to the development in something like Summerlin, who was able to recognize when they built to be able to build these trees and make it cooler, as opposed to disparaging that and saying in these other areas they don't have trees. I think their intent was, with new development and new zoning, the requirement is that you have to do some things and think forward, and not necessarily criticize the fact that folks have recognized, hey, let's plant some trees, and now they're bad suddenly because these other areas don't have them. So I think that keeping it open-minded and, again, moving forward on solving some of these issues and problems in Southern Nevada, but not just Southern Nevada, everywhere. We have to be thoughtful about how much water they're using and do they give adequate shade to even plant them. And so habitat is critical. I mean, we have to look at habitat throughout our state. And thank you, Assemblyman Ellison, for mentioning rural areas and what's happening there and what we're doing. No one's mentioned wild horses and some of the impact on the trees in the urban areas. And, we talk about urban, but there's other things that are impacting our state that we have to look at this overall view of what we are doing or what we're not doing and what we choose to ignore, because I feel strongly that we're ignoring some things that we really should be talking about and not addressing some of the impacts to our rural areas also. And so thank you for the presentation, but would love to see more about what we're doing with our Nevada Division of Forestry. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to comment and the question.
Of course. Thank you very much, Assemblywoman Titus. And again, my intent is not to disparage any neighborhood. Again, a new development is much more water efficient, much more energy efficient. And so I think the question that comes up is what to do to help some of those older communities, pardon me, that that do not aren't enjoying some of those benefits, and focusing some of the efforts on delivering some of the benefits of kind of more forward-thinking policy and newer technology, depending on what we're talking about, so that everybody has the ability to enjoy them. And certainly appreciate your comments about our rural communities as well. I think one of the reasons that we wanted presentations on what other states and communities are thinking about is to think that, again, we're the state legislature, and so we want to work in partnership with our local governments. We want to recognize that all of our communities are different, but that Nevada is a state that gets hot all over, and so figuring out how we can help support every community in this state in addressing some of these issues, and perhaps providing a framework that local governments can then build off of to come up with something that is appropriate for their communities. And if you have any suggestions on rural issues related to heat or some of the other topics that are being brought forward, always encourage you to share those with us so that we can consider them. Members, are there any other questions? I believe Senator Hansen. Very characteristic arm wave. Go ahead,
Yes,
Senator.
thank you. I want to make sure I got your attention, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity. First of all our local communities have been doing these things for years. So the idea that we at the legislative level need to somehow encourage them to think about planting trees is just, I don't know about maybe in North Las Vegas or wherever they don't have trees, they haven't done it. But for Sparks and Lovelock and Winnemucca and Elko, they've been extensively taking care of those issues for decades. And I would like to invite you to come to Northern Nevada, and you can go to the poor parts of town there, like Sun Valley, where my wife grew up, and notice that it is loaded with trees that grew naturally and that the people themselves there have grown. I really have to take issue with the Phoenix, Arizona slide that was presented by the Nature Conservancy. Somehow there is a correlation in that child poverty is almost caused by a lack of tree canopy cover, and that kind of correlation. I want to say right off the bat that is the kind of nonsense that makes tremendous friction in these kind of conversations. That is just nonsense, okay? Trees grow naturally. You don't have to have the government there to plant them all the time. And the question I have, though, is you mentioned water hog trees. Now, in most of the parks in the northern areas, we have Fremont cottonwoods. That's the most common one, and it provides tremendous shade for acres of ground, but they also are considered water hog trees. Are you suggesting that the 60,000 trees or the 100,000 trees in Clark County should all be Palo Verdes or screw beans you mentioned? Because I know for a fact that while they provide a tiny sliver of shade, they don't provide anything close to what so-called water hog trees do. So just kind of wondering how you reconcile the need for shade and the need for water for the tree.
Thank you for the question, Senator Hansen. For the record, Jane Amone. And I think that comes with planning and really looking at what, with the community that is interested in expanding urban tree canopy or to expand urban tree canopy would involve planning. And that would involve, again, a species list of suitable trees we have wonderful resources already developed to do those and wise selection of the placement of those trees and a program that can help care for those trees for the lifetime. I don't know enough personally specifically about the water needs of individual trees to make those decisions, but we have fortunately good resources that are developed by Nevada Division of Forestry and the cities and the water authorities and even the rural communities that you just talked about. Absolutely. I've been through those rural communities and they are beautiful communities with urban tree canopy. And so I think I was just making the point that there are some areas that have a paucity of urban tree canopy, and perhaps this is something that is suitable for everybody. So let's think about how to bring everybody the benefits of an urban tree canopy and how to do that in a way that works with our own arid environment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say, though, that this is one of those deals where we talk like it's a universal problem in the state of Nevada, when in fact it's not. There may be isolated pockets in Clark County, but to say, we need a legislative mandated policy for the state of Nevada, when in fact almost all the counties and cities already have these extensive programs, just makes, once again, no sense. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Hansen. And if we want to make sure that we have some population limits in place to make sure that certain communities don't benefit from any programs that we might put together to support initiatives to help plant trees or keep people cool, I'm more than welcome to entertain those concepts. And I'd just like to also note that correlation in data doesn't mean causation. Assemblywoman Bilbray-Axelrod.
Thank you, Chair. And as an alternate on this committee, I almost feel like I'm in bizarro world because I didn't know we were going to fight over trees. I think most of us all like trees. I've never met anyone who doesn't like a tree. I will point out, though, and we do have the majority of the population of the state of Nevada in Clark County, and we've also talked about Reno. So I think a pop cap, if you guys don't like trees, I heard a tree hugger up there. I also would like to point out, and you can, mesquites provide tremendous amount of shade, and they're very water smart. So I appreciate what you're doing, and don't we all love trees?
Thank you very much. And I do know that Assemblywoman Hansen, you have a question. Given the interests of time, I think that we're going to kind of limit everyone to one bite at the apple today. But if you'd like, I'd please encourage you to send your question to Ms. Moen directly, and then any information that comes out of that we can get shared with the committee.
Chair,
so do any other members?
Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's not a question, actually. I wanted to make a comment in regards to my colleague that just spoke. We all love trees, okay? I don't even think we have to say that. It's what kinds of underlying comments are being inferred in the presentation is what we are trying to address. And we certainly know where the majority of the population is in Nevada, but just a reminder, we all represent the same amount of people for the most part in the state of Nevada. So I'm always offended when we have to be reminded that somehow majority rule because they're all in Clark County. But as legislators, we all have about 63,000-ish, regardless of where we live. And that'll change a little bit with the redistricting. So I just felt I needed to kind of put that to rest. We're all Nevadans. Thank you,
Assemblywoman. And I will put any more back and forth between the members to rest as well. Again, as stated previously, we always welcome the perspective and suggestions of members all across the state. So with that, Thank you again for the presentation, Ms. Moen. We appreciate it. We will now move on to our next agenda item. Also, I'd just like to put a few things out there for members of the public and members of the committee to be aware of. One is that given the pace that we're going at, we are going to be taking a break for lunch. I expect that break to probably last a half hour, and it's going to be sometime around 12:30. We'll see, depending on how the agenda flows. Also, I'd just like to note that due to some time constraints, after we finish, we're going to go to our next item, which is agenda item number 6, which is the last presentation related to extreme heat issues. We will then hear from a presenter for agenda item number 11, who has some time constraints. And then I believe after that, we will be taking a break for lunch, just so everyone understands what to expect. So with that, we now have an overview of Heat Ready Phoenix, a program to comprehensively manage the dangers of extreme urban heat on public health in the city of Phoenix. We'll welcome our presenter. You may introduce yourself for the record and proceed whenever you are ready. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. It's an honor to be joining you this afternoon. Dave Hondula from the City of Phoenix. I serve as our Director of Heat Response and Mitigation, a role I've been in for just 8 months. And in my slides, I'll talk about how we got to this point in the City of Phoenix to have a person in office who are focused on this challenge of extreme heat. Just a few comments before we get into the slides. I've really appreciated hearing the discussion that you all have been having thus far today. I'd like to highlight that I've had the great fortune to enjoy some collaboration with your colleagues and collaborators in the state of Nevada, both in a project that NASA was involved with in mapping urban heat in Washoe County. And regularly we have participants from Southern Nevada join an Arizona heat resilience work group meeting to share some of our experiences in trying to help the public meet some of the health risks associated with heat. Of course, I'm coming to you from the city of Phoenix, and I've heard the rural-urban dynamic, and I will certainly be presenting an urban perspective on the topics, but I appreciate that there are broader concerns in a large and diverse state like Nevada and Arizona. I appreciate the perspective that heat is not a new challenge to either of our states. It has been something we've been thinking about, whether it's in the public health sector or the occupational sector for many decades, as has been suggested. I agree, but I hope I'll be able to present a little bit of evidence that perhaps there's a little bit more we can do to help certain members of our communities. And certainly acknowledge that I'm here to learn along with you. I think cities across the United States are really just at the early steps of learning how we can do a better job protecting people from what is either the nation's leading or second leading weather-related cause of death, and certainly looking forward to more shared learning. We are focused on extreme heat in this new role with the City of Phoenix for the same reasons that we heard from many of the folks who provided public testimony at the very start of the meeting. We've seen a really troubling increase in heat-associated deaths here in our region, 450% increase since 2014. And unfortunately, our city of Phoenix ranks at the top of the list in terms of the per capita rate of heat-associated deaths here in Maricopa County, where there are more than 20 other jurisdictions. This trend far outpaces anything we'd expect with respect to population growth, demographic transition. It's occurring much faster than any sort of change we'd expect with the climate, and we're very confident that it is not a reporting signal. Instead, we understand this trend to be driven in part by what we're seeing in our community with an increase in homelessness. And we also think it is coupled to what's happening with substance abuse, particularly the opioid crisis that continues to plague our cities. We heard about heat as a quality of life challenge from some of the folks who provided public testimony. And in a project that the Nature Conservancy helped convene here in Arizona that was alluded to, we heard many quotes like this in elementary school gymnasiums on Saturday mornings, community meetings and weekday evenings, talking about limited physical activity and questions about what that means for chronic health conditions in our communities. And these types of testimonies are certainly more evident in some neighborhoods than others, where folks have fewer abilities to go outside and safely recreate during the extreme summer heat that we have. Just to give a sense of the scale of the problem, when our county health department and when academic partners have conducted surveys to ask people in different ways how their quality of life is impacted by extreme heat, in some cases, 25%, 33% or more will say that, for example, they're too hot inside their home during the year. They experience some adverse health effects related to extreme heat. Those are all impacts in quality of life that we at the city would like to work on to help continue to improve the quality of life for our residents. We also recognize that there's an economic side to the story. The Nature Conservancy also commissioned a report about the economic impacts of extreme heat here in our county, and they estimated potential losses in the billions as we look forward to mid-century without effective heat response and heat mitigation strategies. And we'll talk a little bit about what those strategies might be. Both here in Arizona and in Nevada, I think we're really leading the way in terms of growth and investment from all over the world in our communities, which is great to see and creating new opportunities for us. And we also see headlines about some of the climate challenges that we have in our two states. And we certainly want to be doing everything we can at the city to ensure that as these headlines can continue to appear about the inevitable doom and gloom that is apparently facing our cities, that in fact the reality reflects that we are investing in protecting people from extreme heat. We're investing in cooling our hot neighborhoods, showing that we are a safe place and a really great place to invest as we move forward. So one of the challenges that's emerged in the heat conversation in recent years is whose problem is this? Who's working on the problem? And this is a question that we've been entertaining here in Central Arizona. Our major newspaper in the state, the Arizona Republic, produced this story a number of years ago that provided 30 individual stories about people who had succumbed to heat exposure the previous year. And we held a workshop with many stakeholders to try to understand who's working on the types of activities that could have intervened in these cases. And you can see the quote on the slide here that was in a meeting report. Workshop participants had differing ideas on who bears responsibility for preparing for and responding to extreme heat. In other words, some of the comments that we heard from members of the committee, a sense of siloed activities, a sense of lack of coordination. And we even heard from professional emergency managers in these meetings that they weren't sure if it was appropriate for them to be in the room in the first place. So if it's not clear whose responsibility or the groups of organizations and actors that can be involved in responding to this problem, I hope we might all agree that it's possible, at least, that too many individuals would fall through the cracks, that we're not as well prepared as we could be to help protect people from this serious weather hazard. Fortunately, here in Arizona, we've had a wonderful trajectory of engagement on this topic, bringing together many stakeholders, largely convened from public health. Our local public health department here has one of the best heat health surveillance programs in the country. That's part of the reason why our numbers were so high on that earlier slide. And because they've been involved in reporting those cases for more than 15 years now, I think they've really emerged as a leader in our region, and they are the ones who can convene other folks to bring them to the table. But we've also learned that the reach of public health is not as far as it could be or as it might need to be in protecting people from extreme heat and designing our cities to be cooler and more comfortable. And that is what motivated the city of Phoenix to come to the table, recognizing that cities have their hands on certain levers that public health, which here in Arizona is managed at the county level, does not. So the Phoenix mayor and city council in the public budget last year put forward a new approximately $3 million climate package, about half of which was for trees. And I know we've had a lot of conversation about trees today, but it also included investment in new positions, including park staff for urban forestry, including some other folks in the water strategy department to help address some of our water challenges. But the piece of this investment that I represent is our new Office of Heat Response and Mitigation, the first publicly funded office of its kind anywhere in the country. We have essentially no programmatic budget. Our entire budget is for staffing, and you can see the positions reflected in the office here on the slide, where you can see there's a specialist for urban forestry, another specialist to think about the non-forestry related cooling strategies for the city. And we sit as part of the city manager office here at the city of Phoenix, which implies that we have a cross-departmental coordinating role and responsibility, looking for opportunities for efficiency, looking for opportunities to bring together different programs that maybe haven't worked together before on these topics. And my experience thus far, 8 months onto the job, is that those opportunities have been quite abundant. Also note that the larger climate package here on last year's budget was the single most popular item in terms of public comments received during our public hearing process on the budget, which is quite extensive. So what do we think an Office of Heat Response and Mitigation might do? This is a question we continue to ask ourselves day in and day out, but we offer a few initial ideas here. There are 8 pieces of our vision. We won't touch all of them for the sake of time, but just to highlight a couple. The first on the slide here is we're really trying to think about 2 buckets of activity for our work. Responding to extreme heat with short-term strategies that can protect us when it is hot, and longer-term strategies that can help cool the city and make it more comfortable. That accounts for the 2-part name of our office: heat response and heat mitigation. We're certainly trying to be data-driven, trying to evaluate our work to understand what's effective and what's cost-effective as we deploy public resources to address this hazard. We're also very much trying to be responsive to community needs and guidance. And we've heard some testimony today that suggests that people's experience with heat is quite different from neighborhood to neighborhood or population to population. And we are trying to focus our efforts where there's the greatest opportunity for public health improvement, looking at the groups and neighborhoods that are most disproportionately impacted by extreme heat. We had the chance to write the city's first heat response plan, looking forward to this summer, and that plan is in effect as we speak. And I wanted to share just a few highlights from that plan, including the goals of the plan. Our goals are to reduce the adverse public health impacts of extreme heat, and we can measure those impacts in 2 ways. Including with the heat-associated death statistics that our county health department produces, as well as the number of calls that are related to heat that our fire department receives. And of course, we want to provide as much service as possible to the public, but we think looking at those data are a good proxy for the demand and need in the community. And finally, we have the third goal to evaluate all of the programs and services that the city operates related to heat. There are more than 30 of them. Many of them are led by other departments. They're not ours. But nationally, we do not have a terrific sense at the city scale of what works, what really should we be investing in to protect our first responders, to protect underserved communities. And that'll certainly be work we undertake in the fall after the warm season is done. We're trying to build, across our plan, we're trying to build activity, build momentum in 6 different thematic areas, including situational awareness, public engagement and communications, having more access to cool space and water, having healthier home environments, having healthy and safe mobility and recreation, and also supporting healthy workplaces and schools. Although I note, as was alluded to in earlier presentations, the jurisdiction for occupational matters and schools here in the city of Phoenix and Arizona really falls outside of the city's purview. So we play a supportive role in that last category. Just to highlight a few pieces of the plan, we're trying to do a better job being situationally aware of what is happening with extreme heat in the community, bringing together many different data sources to have our pulse on what's happening, looking at, for example, how we're trending year to date with respect to those fire department calls for service. And are we seeing any particular hotspots in the community that we haven't seen in previous years? If so, we can shift some of our outreach efforts to those neighborhoods. And speaking of our outreach efforts, we have two major programs that we coordinate from the city. One is called our We're Cool program. This includes staff members and volunteers who are out on the street talking largely to our unsheltered neighbors, not only to put a cold bottle of water in their hands or a cooling towel, but also to share information about where nearby cooling centers and hydration stations are. And this year, for the first time, and this is one of the happy marriages we've been so happy to be able to facilitate, we have case managers from our homeless services team out with us. So when questions come up, as they often do, about food stamps, about identification, about showers, about shelter, we can answer those questions as well. And we know that answering those questions is really what's going to make an impact in the long term in reducing the public health impacts of extreme heat. We're also trying to focus on folks who might get too hot inside their home, when their air conditioner breaks, having trouble paying their electricity bills. So we have a proactive program where we will be calling out from the city to folks who have opted into a program for a telephone-based wellness check. We have a cooling ordinance in the city of Phoenix that was in place well before this office started. It requires homes to be able to be cooled to 82 degrees with air conditioning, 86 with evaporative cooling. This is led by our neighborhood services department team, and I understand that they've been quite proactive over the last few years, such that the number of calls, particularly from repeat offenders, has really gone down. Here, as is the case in Southern Nevada, air conditioning can really be a lifeline. And I've been encouraged to hear this proactive dialogue that neighborhood services has had with the landlord community to ensure that more individuals are protected. We'll also be expanding our weatherization program. This is one of the ways we're putting American Rescue Plan Act funding to work, particularly trying to help homes that haven't fit into the typical mold for weatherization based on federal guidelines around the traditional weatherization program. We think we can help some different types of homes than we're normally able to do. We do have a robust network of cooling centers and hydration stations. You can see the map here. We won't talk about it in any great detail, but I did want to share an experience that we're seeing so many folks here, as I think might be the case in Nevada as well. So many folks who are new to homelessness and new to homelessness in our area. We've unfortunately been just 100, 200 yards away from the door to a public cooling center, chatting with someone who might be living in the park or living in their car. And they just simply aren't aware that door was open to them, or that there was a cold cold water fountain on the exterior of the building. So one of our pieces of advice is that we can't over message about the heat relief network. And another new service that we're so happy our utility has made possible here in Phoenix this year, folks can get free rides to cooling centers and hydration stations through our statewide 211 service. First, I want to acknowledge that this is not a city effort alone. There are a lot of other really important pieces to the pie, including the heat health surveillance program, the wonderful work from our weather forecast office, what utilities are doing to keep the power on, keep it reliable, folks at other groups, efforts from other groups in the community to help folks pay their bills who might be struggling, and some of the capacity building efforts from the Nature Conservancy and other groups like Phoenix Revitalization Corporation that we've heard about already. While the focus of my remarks today is really on those short-term measures to protect public health, I did want to dip my toes into the heat mitigation water a little bit, particularly since it's been such a lively point of conversation thus far with the committee. And I wanted to first observe how our work and how our thinking around heat mitigation is so intersectional with other efforts at the city and in our region. One of the major efforts in our region is to increase the use of active and public transportation. There's a very ambitious goal our regional transportation organization has put forward. This would represent at least a doubling, although it might be an increase of 4 or 5 times over where we are today, and folks using active transportation and using public transportation. And we think that solving the heat piece of the puzzle is really important to be able to achieve that goal. If folks perceive it to be too hot, they're not comfortable, they don't think it's safe to be walking to their transit stop, we don't think there's any way we could achieve this goal. And as such, we are certainly investing in urban forestry. We have new commitments in the city budget. We're using federal funding to support urban forestry. We're trying to encourage private investment as well. We've been really happy to have some corporate donations to support this effort. And we're trying to be thoughtful about how we do this to support the historically underserved neighborhoods where tree canopy cover is low and where people say they suffer from heat at a higher rate. One of the tools, which is available to communities in Nevada as well, the cities in Nevada, is the American Forests Tree Equity Score Map, which has assigned a numerical score to every census block group in cities across the country to help get a sense of those communities that might not be receiving the benefits of trees as fully as others. American Forests have been terrific partners with us. We've made a pledge for tree equity with them, and part of that pledge has increased our access to corporate donation money that's enabled us to accelerate some of our tree planting efforts. We are just starting the process of revising our tree and shade master plan, which hasn't been touched since 2010. And unfortunately, we've been barely treading water toward the goals that were put forward in this plan. In part, I would argue because of a lack of public investment that accompanied this plan when it was written. 2010 was a very tough time for all government operations, still recovering from the recession. So I think this plan landed at an unfortunate spot in time, but I also don't know that we resourced the plan as fully as we could. We, in the Tree and Shade Master Plan revision, will certainly be thinking about these tensions that have been discussed today with respect to maintenance, with respect to watering, and there will be a robust public engagement process that accompanies it. And finally, this is the last substantive slide. Some of you might have seen headlines in the newspaper about the Cool Pavement Program here in the city of Phoenix. This is led by our Street Transportation Department. More miles of city streets have received a cool pavement coating here than any other city in North America, as best we can tell. The atmosphere is heated from the ground up. And when we look at thermal imagery from space or from helicopters of the city, there's one feature that clearly stands out as the hottest, and that's the road network. So in theory, anything we can do to make those hot surfaces cooler will produce benefits in terms of cooling the city, perhaps reducing our energy bills. This is not the entire, this is not the entirety of our strategy to cool the city. Cool Pavement, for example, does not provide shade for pedestrians, but we think it can be an effective part of our strategy in cooling those hot surfaces. And we're seeing some encouraging results that suggest that the Cool Pavement coating might allow for longer lifespan of the underlying asphalt column, which could produce cost savings for taxpayers. With that, I'll just wrap up by saying thank you and share this observation that every week since I've been on the job, since starting in October, I do see evidence from my colleagues here on City Hall that I think the city has made a good investment in creating this office. I don't know about the personnel choice that they chose in hiring me individually, but so often it's the case that somebody from another department will come to me and say, I've been working on this project that I think could be really impactful for improving quality of life in the city, something related to heat. Maybe it's a certain part of the zoning code or a permitting process, but it's never really been my job to work on it. I haven't really had support from my leadership to work on it, but now you're here. You're in the city manager office. You have this office that has this title to focus on heat. People think it's your job to focus on heat. Maybe you can take this package and run with it and see it succeed. And I wonder how much of that untapped energy there is in cities all across the country when just because we have not had a culture of it being anybody's responsibility to heat, we've missed a lot of opportunities. I'll end there and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you presenting to us. I think that your city has been a leader in looking at how to address this from a local government level. I also just really briefly want to say that I appreciate the mention of the other Nature Conservancy study looking at the costs, and so and looking at some of these things as investments. And I think it is helpful to have data that allows us to do some of those cost and benefit comparisons when looking at particularly public sector investments in trying to address some of these things, and would love to see how we could try and get some state and region specific data on that. I also really appreciate your remarks around kind of who's responsible and there being shared responsibility and particularly in getting the word out about some of the resources that are available. I think that follows up on some of the comments from our members in terms of the importance of education and coordination. I would just ask that if you could follow up with some of the information on what you're thinking around weatherization and how we can kind of build out some of those programs to be more robust than that kind of federally funded baseline. I think that would be interesting. And finally, that I find the temperature standards for some of the rentals really fascinating, and it kind of establishing a concept of a right to be cool or to have to be protected from extreme heat in your home. So thank you again for sharing. We're going to open it up to questions. We'll start with Assemblywoman Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing a question. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your presentation. I'm interested, in addition to loving trees, I also love good data, but I always like to kind of pick into that and make sure that the percents and where you're getting some of these numbers, I can look it up and know so I can do some of my own research. So looking at your slide early on in this, number 2, where you have the 454% increase since 2014 in Maricopa County of heat-related or heat-associated deaths. Where has your population? What's been your population increase in that period of time? I'm curious about that. Number one. Number two, what's the breakdown on between the 61 deaths in 2014 and the 338 deaths in 2021? What age group was it? Were they in homes? Were they, did you see an increased percent because of COVID? Did you see an increased percent because of illnesses related with that heat? Do you have a breakdown of that or someplace I can go to research that? Where did you get that number? Because it's, you can do a percent, but then what's the actual breakdown of that? And was there a change? Did you have a marathon? I'm a marathon runner. Heat stroke is important. Did you have an event where more people died? So can I get some follow-up on that, please?
Mr. Chair and Assemblywoman Titus, Dave Hondula for the record. Thank you for the question. I share your enthusiasm for data and understanding the data. And fortunately, there are comprehensive reports that are publicly available from the Maricopa County Department of Public Health that I believe have most, if not all, of the answers to the questions that you've asked. Heataz.org is a shortcut to get to their page, and they really do have a nice, robust annual report. To answer a couple of your questions briefly, the percent increase absolutely far outpaces anything we'd expect with respect to population growth. The population growth is, I believe we're in the neighborhood of a few to several percent over a decade time span, and here we're talking about just 7 or 8 years. The numbers are not population adjusted. I take your point there, but the pattern would essentially be the same. The breakdown between indoor and outdoor and age groups does show some interesting variability year in and year out. To answer a couple of the questions you had toward the end, I was very surprised to learn that in 2020 and 2021, very few of the cases, I think just 2 or 3, had a positive indication of COVID amongst the decedent in the medical examiner's process. I expected it to be much higher. Being sick with COVID makes one heat vulnerable, and being sick from heat might make one more COVID vulnerable. I'm not sure. I'm not a medical doctor, but I was surprised to see that the overlap was so small. If COVID is partially responsible for the increase, it would then have to be through other mechanisms, which could include the closing of public buildings that served as cooling centers, although we had some compensating strategies here. Certainly more work to do to understand the nature of those relationships. And I'm not aware that any singular event has really led to this increase. I do believe it's largely related to what we've seen with increase in our unsheltered community. The math is very fuzzy. It's hard to get a sense of the denominator of what the exact population is. Folks experiencing homelessness here in Maricopa County, but our best estimate using the point in time data that are publicly available from the Maricopa Association of Governments, we use that as a denominator, and what the County Health Department reports as a numerator would suggest that our unsheltered neighbors are at 200 to 300 times higher risk of heat-associated death. So every day that goes forward, when we see more people on the streets, those are more people who are absolutely in that very high risk category. Thank you again for the question.
Great, sir. Thank you. And if I might follow up, I am a medical doctor and I am a county health officer. So I was really asking for that association of what diseases and other entities might have been happening in that window of time where we saw the increase. So thank you for that. And one more question, if I might. I'm interested in the cool pavement program. I think that's a great idea. I think anything we can do to mitigate the heat on that blacktop is good, and especially if it saves the pavement. I'm wondering what the cost of that is, and if you could tell me where I can go to find what that costs your city, how efficient is it, where are you getting the resources, what chemicals you're using, and there's always a risk versus benefit category when we're looking at this, and just wondering some more information about that cool pavement program and where I might go to find it.
Mr. Chair, Assemblywoman Titus, Dave Hondula for the record. Thank you for the question. I'd love to connect you with our Street Transportation Department for some of those technical and engineering details, particularly the cost. I do know that there has been an ongoing conversation with the manufacturers, with the contractors, not only to improve the material itself that's being applied to the pavement, trying to address some concerns about glare and color, but also durability that have come up over time, but also trying to improve the mechanisms by which the coating itself is applied to the streets. To be able to do this at scale, of course, we'd have to have a vehicle that can go relatively quickly. The original photographs of cool pavement in Los Angeles and Phoenix show individual workers out with squeegees on the roads and with thousands and thousands of miles of roads in our city, where we'd never be able to really progress forward in a meaningful way with that approach. So we have seen a lot of innovation. I think that means that the cost question is an evolving one. We do try to, we certainly do try to engage public in understanding of their perception as this coating has been applied. We'll be standing up even a more robust public engagement process as it moves forward. Some of the survey research that has been done suggests, I mean, maybe just to the north side of positive in terms of public perception, but a really wide range of opinions. We will certainly have the case where we'll be standing on a street corner with someone who thinks this is a brilliant solution and they wish we could do it citywide. At the same time, we receive an email from somebody who might be concerned about some of these trade-offs, and we're absolutely working to solve those trade-offs. Thank you for the question.
And thank you, sir. And I appreciate your comment about the varied opinions, because that's what the reality is. There's so many different opinions here. So thank you for your presentation. I appreciate your time. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question.
Thank you. We'll go next to Assemblyman Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And she had exactly every question I had. But one thing maybe you could answer, is that actually cement or is it a slurry that you're putting onto that asphalt? I think that's the greatest thing in the world, because asphalt creates heat. But I think that's a great idea. So do you know if it's cement mix or if it's some kind of clergy solution that goes on that asphalt?
Mr. Chair and Assemblyman Ellison, Dave Fondula, for the record, thank you for the question. It is a coating, a slurry type coating. There is some information available on our Street Transportation Department website that I'll be happy to send to the committee, but it is a very thin coating. It's applied with a sprayer on top of the asphalt column.
I think it's a great idea, and I think I think some of the big cities should look at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman Ellison. Other questions from members of the committee? Okay, I'm going to take advantage. I don't see anyone. So again, thank you. I think this is an extremely informative and helpful presentation, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. Again, members, we are going to, in order to accommodate speakers, we are going to move briefly to agenda item 11. In particular, we are going to just hear from the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health at the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland. And then after that, we will be taking a 30-minute lunch break, after which we'll go back to our original agenda order. So with that, I'd like to welcome our representative to speak a little bit about environmental justice issues as we move on from heat issues specifically. And whenever you're ready, you can state your name for the record and begin. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me today. My name is Kelby Wilson. I'm happy to be here. Let me share my screen. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is get to the button. Is to do a quick overview of climate change issues related to environmental justice and environmental health disparities. So what is environmental justice? Just a quick history. Environmental justice, part of it is a social movement. In many ways is connected to the civil rights movement. And the movement talks about how some communities due to race, class, other demographic features are overburdened by what we would call environmental hazards, so locally wanted land uses. That could be incinerators, petrochemical operations, chemical plants, uses that could to release pollution and impact human health. And so there's been a long-standing movement that's been around for about 40 years or more. You can even say it's connected to Dr. King's work when he was assassinated in Memphis with the Central Worker Strike. And then you have the PCB landfill fight in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. But it's really a social movement connected to, these issues around differential burden of hazards and talking about these issues in microenvironments we find ourselves in. So basically where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we learn. And now you can have differential exposures, differential burdens, differential exposures, differential health effects. The EPA has a definition of environmental justice. It's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So this is a original EPA definition. Under Executive Order 14008, the White House established the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So it's providing advice to the White House on environmental justice issues. And they redefine environmental justice and they change fair treatment to just treatment. And they define an environmental justice community means a geographic location with significant representation of persons of color, low-income persons, indigenous persons, or members of tribal nations, with such persons experience or at risk of experiencing higher, more adverse human health and environmental outcomes. Another definition that I like to quote is from Dr. Bunyan Bryant, a professor emeritus at the University of Michigan, who says environmental justice is served when people can realize the highest potential without experiencing isms. So for those of you in public health, you may have heard of the term social determinants of health. In this definition, he's really talking about social determinants of health as being important drivers of environmental injustice, or could it help achieve environmental justice? So decent paying and safe jobs, quality schools, recreation, decent housing, adequate healthcare. So really about the infrastructures in our communities. And communities are free of violence, drugs, and poverty. So those are also be classified as stressors. And then when you think about environmental justice, when we break it down by the types of justice, you have recognitional justice, where you have folks who are most impacted by the problems are at the decision-making table. You have distributive justice, making sure that the benefits are basically across the board, equally across the board. You have intergenerational justice is another component. And you also have a restorative justice. So making sure we restore communities to what they were before. In many cases, when we think about environmental injustice, we don't want to restore them to what they were before because of issues like racism. They may have been actually worse off than other communities in a similar geographic region. So making them better than what they were before is important as well. There have been a lot of studies that looked at the issue of environmental justice from a science perspective. One of the first studies was toxic waste and race in the US in 1987, follow-up study done in 2007, and basically found that race is a significant predictor, the most significant predictor of the distribution of hazardous waste facilities in the country. And this has been found not just for hazardous waste facilities, but other uses as well. So when it comes to power plants, gas or coal, when it comes to incinerators, landfills, I've done work on industrial chicken farms, industrial hog farms. Again, we see that race, income is important. When we do statistical analysis, race is more important. So when I think about environmental justice, I like to talk about from a three-legged stool perspective. So you have communities that are overburdened by hazards, as already been stated. Some of these same communities have a high concentration of psychosocial stressors. And then as indicated by some of the previous presentations, some of these communities also have a lack of access to infrastructure. So you can think about ecologic infrastructure, natural infrastructure. There's a study was done a couple of years ago called the Nature Gap, that African Americans and other people of color have 3 times less access to nature compared to their white counterparts, and low wealth populations have 3 times less access to nature compared to their wealthy counterparts. This is important when it comes to climate change, mitigation, adaptation. You can think about also built infrastructure, access to supermarkets, grocery stores, schools, and other types of infrastructure. So you can have positive health promoting infrastructure, where they have limited access to, or you have negative pathogenic infrastructure, which they may have an overabundance of. And again, race is an important kind of driver of the distribution of hazards or goods and ills. And so studies have shown that there's a pollution advantage for some populations, 70% less air pollution exposure for whites compared to body consumption, while Blacks and Hispanics on average bear a pollution burden, 56% and 60% access exposure. So air pollution is important to talk about in the environmental justice context, because you can have sources of air pollution, both mobile and stationary sources that disproportionately in these communities. And when you're exposed to air pollution, it can impact you in utero. So it can impact the development of a child. It can impact that child during their younger years, right? Because children have a higher inhalation rate per kilogram body weight compared to the adult counterparts. blood-brain barrier does not solidify until age 9 or 10. So things can cross the blood-brain barrier, and so there could be development problems, and also, of course, respiratory issues. We know that a lot of children are riding school buses that can be exposed to diesel exhaust of black carbon, which can also contribute to adverse health outcomes. It may be also impacted by air pollution as adults, and of course, in your elderly years, when you may have comorbidities, and you may have immune system issues, which means you can be at higher risk of some of these health effects. And so air pollution is one of the greatest issues that we can be exposed to. It can impact life expectancy. So when you think about exposure to particulate matter, you can lose 1.8 years of your life. And when you think about this environmental justice science, again, you can have different types of land uses. There can be disparities in burden. Then it can be disparities in exposure to various stressors, whether it be chemical stressors. And if you think about lead and mercury or particulate matter, there can be disparities in exposure to biological stressors as well. Then you think about SARS-CoV-2, mold mildew allergens. There can be exposure to physical stressors. You've heard a lot of presentations about heat. Think about noise pollution as well. And then psychosocial stressors. You can have disparities in risk from various climate change related perturbations. And also, and those disparities can lead to health disparities. So you think about health disparities, we talk a lot from an environmental justice science perspective, or I'm an environmental health scientist. Some of the chemicals I've already mentioned. We know that lead is a big issue in older homes, and the impacts on children, and it's a neurocognitive, the effects that it has. And again, when you live in communities that may be dealing with the cumulative impacts of air quality issues, for example, and cumulative impacts is a very important term that the US EPA is focused on now in trying to find ways to better address the cumulative impacts of permitted facilities, whether it be facilities permitted under the Clean Air Act, facilities permitted under Clean Water Act, NIPD's National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NIPD's permits, facilities that may be permitted under other regulations, trying to understand the cumulative impacts of the emissions from those facilities, how they impact environmental quality, how they impact human health, and how they impact quality of life. So when you think about environmental justice and climate change, this is just a slide that some of you may have seen that are more developed countries, we emit more greenhouse gas emissions, but those who contribute least to greenhouse gas emissions will be impacted most by climate change, so are developing countries. And so you see a similar type of issue in the US context. Just one quick example that maybe not as relevant for the state of Nevada, but the issue of hurricanes and environmental justice. We know that last year, 7 named storms hit the Gulf Coast. I think in most named storms, the history of named storms hit the Gulf Coast. And ironically, Hurricane Ida hit New Orleans on the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And so you see differences in the impacts of hurricanes because of underlying economic and social vulnerabilities, right? Some people were able to get out of harm's way. Some people were able to rebound quicker. Some people were able to, have access to health care and health insurance. So there's an intersection between race and income in this case. And so that can be applied to the issue of forest fires. It can be applied to issues of other climate-related perturbations that individuals who have underlying economic and social vulnerabilities are going to be more at risk from those perturbations. And we have to have a focus on equity when it comes to preparedness, response, recovery, and also as it relates to our climate adaptation mitigation efforts to make sure that these populations are thought of too, in the standpoint of how we can be more prepared for climate-related events. So there's been reports from NAACP about some of the sources of greenhouse gases and how they're not distributed equally in the country. And so we see that there's distributional issues, inequities in the distribution of coal power plants in the US. So this is one study that's been done. There's another study done when you think about greenhouse gas emission sources. Of course, fossil fuels are a major source. When we combust fossil fuels, we have oil and gas extraction. You think about hydraulic fracturing or traditional oil and gas wells. You also see there's distributional inequities in that infrastructure of our legacy fossil fuel infrastructure in the US. And again, when we use those fossil fuels to combust those fossil fuels, of course, we get a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to some of the issues that we're talking about as it relates to climate change. And so this is just a figure that shows some of that process. And so when you combust fossil fuels, we could, produce greenhouse gases like methane and CO2. But as I mentioned before, you have these co-pollutants that are produced, like volatile organic compounds, polysaccharide hydrocarbons, and of course, particulate matter, that's the dust in the air that can contribute to the respiratory health outcomes I talked about before, and also have other impacts on human health. So when we talk about climate change, it's just not about the greenhouse gas emissions. The co-pollutants are very, very important for public health. And those populations that are more susceptible to pollutants, like the elderly or children, or more vulnerable because of underlying social and economic issues, we have to try to prioritize resources to make sure we protect those populations. And so I've already talked about particulate matter, but just real quickly, it's important to note that we have national ambient air quality standards for particulate matter. I don't think those standards are protective enough because particulate matter does not just causes asthma and asthma attacks. It can cause heart disease, it can cause stroke, elevate your blood pressure. It can contribute to diabetes and Alzheimer's. It can cause cancer, increase infant mortality rates, birth defects, low birth weight births, cause premature mortality, and also impact life expectancy, as I showed in the previous slide. And then if you think about connection to urban heat and environmental justice, we know that about redlining. If you're familiar with redlining, I'm not, think about the history of loans going into various communities through FHA. Some communities were colored red because of the social demographic composition of that particular area. They had more people of color were colored red, so they may not get those loans. If they had more white residents, they were colored green. That impacted investments and also in the built scape, but also impacted investments as relates to the natural scape. So studies have shown that areas that have history of redlining compared to non-redlining areas are warmer. And there were some discussions earlier about urban heat issues. So there's a connection between heat and redlining and also tree canopy. Baltimore's example of this I want to get into real quickly. Baltimore has a history of segregation, hybrid segregation. Dr. Lawrence Brown did a study on it called the Black Butterfly. And you can see in the first graphic, in the east and west Baltimore is highly segregated with African-American residents. And you see non-Hispanic whites are in the middle of Baltimore. If you look at the slide to the right, you'll see the real estate sales in the butterfly wings compared to the other parts of Baltimore. So you see much higher real estate sales and levels in dollars in the non-Black parts of Baltimore. So that's one example. You can look at redlining and health issues. So if you look at this graphic, you can see the spatial gradient of redlining in the first map, and look at the second map, you can look at life expectancy. You can see a spatial correlation, spatial patterning when it becomes between redlining and life expectancy in years. So there is a correlation there. And this is in public health, we call this work social epidemiology, when you're looking at these associations between social factors and health issues. And also in Baltimore, we've seen a pattern between redline areas in Baltimore. Again, you can look at the east and west part of Baltimore with the butterfly wings, and you see more lead violation cases in those locations. In the first map on the top right hand, and the second map in the bottom, you can see redlining versus the lead violation locations. So again, we see some associations between housing and lead, and the role of segregation and redlining. There are relationships there. In Baltimore, just to talk about another city in the country, and this of course is the urban area, where we know that I've been talking about the butterfly wings in Baltimore, east and west Baltimore. Those areas can be 15 degrees hotter than more affluent areas, again, in the middle of Baltimore. And that's because of the distribution of tree canopy. There was a report done called Code Red in Baltimore, where students use citizen science to place temperature sensors in parts of Baltimore. And we found not just across blocks in Baltimore, we talked about east and west Baltimore, but on the same side of the street in Baltimore, the power of one tree. You can see in the picture that there's a 20-degree difference or more when you have a tree at the row house. And you see even when you go to the houses with two trees, the temperature difference is even higher. So you can see a gradient in temperature because of access to trees, as I mentioned before, because we had differences in tree canopy in some of our cities, like in Baltimore, you see this issue. And also we see differences in air conditioning access as well. So having too much concrete and asphalt plus limited trees and lack of access is basically a formula for people to have higher rates of heat-related morbidity and mortality. In our state of Maryland, Baltimore City has more heat-related mortality, more morbidity events, mortality events than any other city in the state of Maryland. And so you can also look at, again, using spatial correlation to look at temperature and health conditions in Baltimore. And we see again that heat-related deaths and how most of those deaths are in the population most impacted was 60% Black. And a lot of, again, the Black population in Baltimore live in those hyper-segregated areas where you have housing with limited tree access outside, right? And with no air conditioning. And then also you see a similar kind of spatial patterning between when you look at asthma and air pollution. So again, the left-hand side, you see the redlining map again for reference. You look at the first map in the right-hand side, you can look at respiratory risk in Baltimore. And then the second map, you see age-adjusted hospitalization rates per 10,000 people. So again, you see associations between redlining, air pollution, and health outcomes. And I added these slides just to talk about some of the solutions. One of the things that we try to do is do hyperlocal air quality monitoring in areas that are impacted by mobile and stationary sources of air pollution. Again, when you combust fossil fuels, you're creating greenhouse gases, right? Carbon, CO2, methane, but you're also creating those co-pollutants. So one thing to think about in some of the cities and also your rural areas where you have a lot of traffic in the state of Nevada, you can put up sensors to capture particulate matter levels. So this sensor is called the Purple Air. It measures PM 2.5. It also is able to measure temperature. So you can look at the intersection of a physical stressor like heat and also a chemical stressor like particulate matter at the same time. And it helps you, if you can collect this data, you can map the spatial gradient of air pollution and also temperature, you know where you want to do interventions, right? And so this is just a map that shows our PM levels in relationship to wind speed and wind direction in Cheverly, Maryland, which is in Prince George's County where the University of Maryland is. I just want to show you this kind of map, this choropleth map. It's the color map. So of course, the higher the PM levels, the redder the color is. Y'all familiar with weather maps. And we're doing work in partnership with our state agency, environmental agency, the Maryland Department of Environment. So the reason why I mention it is we're trying to collaborate with them to use this data to inform actions to look at the cumulative impacts of air quality in Cheverly. And this is a model that can be used in other parts of Maryland and other parts of the country. We're not the only people who are doing hyperlocal air quality monitoring to look at things like pollution and temperature. But again, you want to figure out where your populations are most impacted, the most concerned are. You want to be able to map this data and then use that data to work with your county agencies, your city agencies, your state agencies to implement some type of intervention. It could be anti-idling, it could be electrification, it could be traffic calming, it could be planting more trees. But this combination of mapping and air quality monitoring, I think is a really important way to make sure you have an evidence-based approach to address these issues. And we're expanding this work right now to our high schools in Prince George's County. So we're trying to put sensors up in every high school in our county to bring in the STEM component, which is important, but also again to get that gradient of where we know population are most impacted or most at risk of air pollution are. Children are very much at risk. Young adults are very much at risk of air pollution. And high schools, community centers, nursing homes, hospitals are what we call sensitive human receptor sites. So being able to monitor those locations will help us track air quality. And again, be able to look at the spatial patterning of air pollution and intervene in those areas. And just real quickly, I know because others have already covered some of the climate and heat issues, and I won't go into that, but there's some tools that may be relevant for you in the state of Nevada. Right now, you may or may not be familiar with Executive Order 1408 that I mentioned before. As part of that, CEQ is developing a national climate economic screening tool. So these are what we call GIS visualization tools to visualize areas that have disadvantaged communities that are most at risk or may have more environmental justice and climate inequities, right? So there's other tools that states have developed. We have a tool called Maryland EJ Screen that I've worked on. California has a tool, Colorado has a tool, Washington State, Oregon have tools, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan have state level mapping tools, and also Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, they also have these mapping tools. So So you're able to bring together data that's context specific to the state of Nevada to really figure out where are the areas that have the most kind of environmental justice or climate equity concerns, right? And so what we do is we have data that has pollution burden, like exposures, hazards, population characteristics, and we come up with a score. And you can map this data at the tract level, at the block group level, the block level, whatever unit of analysis that makes sense for your state. In our domains, we have different indicators. So we have let me go back real quick. So we have a pollution burden exposure. So you can see that's the first one, like air pollution. Pollution burden environmental effects, that's proximity to the land uses that I talked about before, like landfills, incinerators, chemical plants, right? Those would be sources. Sensitive populations, elderly children, folks with underlying health issues, and then those typical social demographic factors, percent Hispanic, percent Black, percent less than high school education. You can also look at bringing class and income related indicators, and it creates a score. So this will allow you to identify, prioritize, and micro-target areas that have the most need, okay? And so we have this EJ screen tool. We also developed a park equity mapping tool for the state of Maryland to look at access to parks and green space. That could be another way to say, hey, we don't have enough green space here. Let's see where we're missing green space. Let's put more green space in. And we also are doing work to bring in indicators that are more relevant to our rural areas. I heard that conversation. Many of these tools are very urban-centric, so they're missing some of the very important rural indicators, access to Wi-Fi. You may have, think about water quality. People may be on septic tanks, or they may be on well water, right? You can bring in other climate indicators like, drought indicators, flooding indicators, seasonal variation in the flooding that you may have in Nevada, maybe something you want to also bring into this type of tool. And so we have a climate and health mapping tool that we're building to try to, it's really contextualized to the state of Maryland. But again, this is an approach that can also be used for Nevada. So you can have an environmental justice mapper, you can have a climate equity health mapper. And I want to close to say that the reason why it's important to use these type of tools when it comes to Executive Order 14008, which is the Justice 40 initiative, as we move from a dirty energy economy to a clean energy economy, 40% of the benefits should go to disadvantaged communities. And the way you get those investments to those communities, those benefits, is through the infrastructure bill. So you can have these type of tools to figure out how to identify, prioritize, and market our communities, and make sure those infrastructure dollars that your state's receiving can go to those communities that have the most need. But you got to have, it has to be evidence-based, it has to be data-driven, and having these type of screening tools could be really useful. And I will end there.
Thank you very much for that extremely comprehensive presentation. We really appreciate it. Well, I'll open it up to members for questions. Senator Hansen.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the presentation, sir. You have 2 pages I want to go to. The NAAC report of coal-blooded. I guess Maryland has a lot of coal-fired plants. We only have 2 in Nevada. The other next page talks about existing natural gas facilities. Now, those are the 2 main sources of energy in the United States. Does Maryland have any nuclear power? And if yes, do you support nuclear power? Because that is a carbon-free source of energy.
Yeah, Maryland does have nuclear power. I would say, not to answer your second question yet, I think it's important to have a diverse energy portfolio. And I know the Department of Energy, under this new administration, is really investing a lot into different forms of energy. I would say that I'm a proponent of clean energy. And I think, there was a recent announcement from the CEQ about hydrogen as another investments in hydrogen infrastructure in the country. I think investing in solar, and geothermal, and wind are very important. And I think also other types of sources are important as well. But I would say that, yes, coal and gas are dominant. And we know that investments in those have increased over time, but we have to create greater accessibility. But yeah, I want to say this. I'm not the biggest fan of nuclear, but I'll say I'm neutral on nuclear, but I'm more into wind, geothermal, and definitely into old school hydroelectric and definitely into hydrogen as a potential as well.
I'm glad you're for
Thank
all those
you.
things.
And
I think
just
most people.
Sorry, Senator. I just want to really quickly. I know that these issues definitely have a relation, and we do have some additional seats in both Carson City and Las Vegas where we could have included the Growth and Infrastructure Committee in this joint meeting as well. But I just wanted to say I don't want us to get too far into the energy mix side because that's. While it is related,
Mr. Chair,
I think that's not the
with all
main
due
issue that we're trying
respect,
to
the whole
address.
presentation is about climate injustice, and we are talking about climate change based on carbon footprints. My question simply was, does the state of Maryland have an extensive nuclear program? And if yes, the question follow-up would be, there's no presentation here showing that those are in neighborhoods of color disproportionately. The presentation suggests that the coal industry and the natural gas industry somehow impacts people of color disproportionately, and I want to know if that's also true of the nuclear industry in Maryland. That's where I was going. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And again, I just want to be extremely clear that again we're looking right now at the kind of downstream impacts, so not as much energy generation sources, and I know that there's when we discuss climate, there's a whole piece around what do you do to reduce emissions that are contributing to warming. Some of that overlaps with some of the air pollution issues, but again, I think the questions here are around issues like pollution and heat and the communities that are affected by that. So
I would agree with that, except the presentation presented went way beyond that. Thank you, Chair.
Would you like to
Do you want me to
respond,
answer? Yes. I cannot answer. Apologize. I cannot answer your question about the nuclear industry, that part of it. But I will say that we just passed a Climate Solutions Now Act that I think is maybe one of a model acts to look to that may be relevant for the state. And we have some grand emission reductions goals. So, but no, I cannot answer a question about the nuclear part.
Thank you. Chair Peters.
Thank you, Chair Watts. Thank you for the presentation. This is really interesting work that's been going on around the country for decades, and Nevada, I feel, is a little behind on our structures and ability to look comprehensively at specifically the cumulative impacts of environmental justice drivers in our state. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how your state is responding to the tools that you've come up with and the discussions that you're having with stakeholders on how are you addressing the foundational problems and overcoming or adapting communities to reduce that injustice and bring equity to your communities.
Well, thank those questions. So we have done a lot of work with our state agency, Maryland Department of Environment, as I mentioned in the Chevrolet example. I think that could be a model for how you build out hyper-local air quality monitoring networks. And the reason why it's important, a lot of the EPA regulatory monitors are not in the communities that have the cumulative impacts. So you're really not capturing the exposure burden, right, and the health burden, because it's not really informed by data. And as environmental health scientists, we call that exposure misclassification. Usually the monitor is 20 miles down from the house, but the factory is right next door, but there's not a monitor next door. That's actually bad science. And so to fill that gap, this hyperlocal air quality monitoring is really important. Also, mobile monitoring is important. Satellite data, remote sense data is filling those gaps. So that's getting at some of the issues of understanding the differential exposure to air pollution and then using that to inform action, right? We also have engaged with legislators in our state on various bills. So that was a 4-year effort to pass the Climate Solutions Now Act that just passed this past session, legislative session. And as I said earlier, I think that act has a lot of equity and justice components in it, including looking at air pollution. As many of y'all said, you talked about trees, so we're also trying to plant trees. And I think I appreciate the question about the maintenance. I think the maintenance question is really an equity issue too, because I think part of the what we want to do to address climate inequities and climate justice, there's a workforce development component to it. So making sure that you have folks engaged on the workforce and business side, so you have sustainability in your programming and your initiatives, That's a piece we want to miss out on. So again, I want to advocate for y'all looking at the Climate Solutions Now Act as a model. And then MDE actually built its own screening tool off of our screening tool. So we're going to have these sister mapping tools now in the state of Maryland. And so I think we have a really good working relationship with the legislators. We have a good working relationship with MDE. We have a good working relationship with our Department of Health, the Environmental Public Health Tracking Program. We're not trying to integrate climate action planning with environmental justice in all the counties in the state of Maryland. So we started that conversation with our state health department, Dr. Cliff Mitchell. And we also have a good working relationship with our state agency, Department of Natural Resources. They're actually the ones that funded our mapping tool. And we're using that tool to do some coastal resilience work and some water resilience work in the state of Maryland. So there's a lot of really positive relationships that I have at my university with many of the state agencies, with the legislature, and also some of the county departments of environment and county health departments. I know that's a long answer, but thank you for the question.
I'm going to ask maybe a quick question, and I'm happy with a follow-up if you want to do that instead of responding. But have you guys set like data quality objectives or metrics to look at critically how effective your actions and your responses and your resiliency programming is? And again, if you guys have that in a some place where we can find it, I'm happy to for just that follow-up.
Yeah. I don't have that part of it, but that's a very important question. So I'm going to switch gears real quick and just respond. I was part of the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and we've been providing a lot of advice to the EPA on metrics as it relates to the Justice 40 initiative. So I think that work could be relevant to your discussion, to the question you just asked. But as part of the follow-up, I can connect you to my colleague at DNR to help you on the data quality and making sure that that you get some of the tracking, the metrics that they're using. So I can do that for you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Other questions from members of the committee? All right. Seeing none, thank you again very much for taking the time to join us and share some of your expertise from your community, as well as some of the things that are happening nationally that we should be aware of in regards to environmental justice and equity. All right, well, members, with that, we are going to take a 30-minute break for lunch. For folks that are familiar with the legislature, you know that our 30-minute breaks tend to spill over. As a matter of fact, I'm going to actually take off 2 minutes, so that we're going to plan to come back at 1:15 exactly. So I want to make sure that we have a quorum, and if you're not a part of that quorum, then we're going to get started without you so we can keep this agenda moving. And we're going to go back to where we left off in the order of the agenda. So thank you, and we are in recess.